Start to take your seats. All right. All right, I want to thank everyone for sticking around, enjoying lunch here. And we're going to kick off our afternoon session with our second lightning talk of the day. This talk will be delivered by Chris Hegarty. He's Director for Communications, Navigation, and Surveillance Engineering and Spectrum at MITRE Corporation. He's going to go through and give us a few lessons from civil aviation. So without further ado, Chris, I want to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Can I have the first chart, please? There it is. So I'm not nearly as brave as my colleague. This will not be a rigorous lightning talk that is automatically advanced. I will do it more leisurely, still only using 5 minutes, but only 5 charts and flipping at my will. If you want to keep a post-lunch talk to under 5 minutes, what better way to do it than to invite someone with no background in civil space to talk at a civil space conference? My background's in almost entirely in civil aviation system development, and I've done that for over 25 years now. And the organizers, who I thank for inviting me to be here with you today, had thought it might be useful to stimulate discussion this afternoon to talk about what's going on with resiliency in the civil aviation community that might carry over to some of the architectures that civil space is dealing with here. So that's the focus of this talk. Before I talk much about resiliency developments in civil aviation, of course it's useful to understand what it is we're talking about when we mention resilience. I like this particular definition. It resonates with me, and I won't read it, but just to paraphrase, resilience is essentially the ability of a system to be able to deal with disruptions, and when the disruptions occur, for the system to be able to continue to work, maybe not as well as it did beforehand, but at least to some acceptable level of performance for some acceptable level of time. I would attest that this chart is showing you 2 resilient systems. On the left, this is not intended to be just one particular civil aircraft, but rather the entire civil aviation ecosystem, including all of the aircraft's fixed and rotary wing, as well as all of the ground and space infrastructure it takes to keep these moving around the world and carrying passengers, cargo, and all the other things that they do. It is inarguably a resilient system. We have today about 114 years of experience in moving humans on motorized aircraft like this. And the safety record is phenomenal. President Trump was proud to announce just a couple weeks ago how many fatal accidents we had on commercial passenger jets worldwide. And what's the number? 0, which is quite an astounding feat. It's hard to do better than that. This is by no means a new thing. The last time that a U.S. flag carrier had a fatal accident was actually 2009. There have been non-U.S. flag carriers that have fatalities in recent years, including on U.S. soil, but U.S. flag carriers have quite an amazing record there. On the right, this is not just the International Space Station, but this is really, again, the entire civil space architecture and missions flown to date. And they also, given the complexity and difficulty of their mission, they also do have a remarkable safety record as well. We have heard today, I guess, about the 15 years that have passed now since the Columbia disaster. I was in high school when the Challenger disaster took place, and of course there was also the Apollo 1 ground incident or accident that killed 3 brave astronauts. But overall, if you look at how difficult these missions are and how many they've flown, 135 shuttle missions, 50-something ISS expeditions, and so on, it is incredible the safety record that they've been able to attain. Before I talk about what's new, it's worthwhile to talk about what has been done well, I guess, over the years. And I guess one thing I forgot to mention that it's very interesting now is in terms of years of experience, we have 114 years of experience with manned flight on aircraft, and exactly half that today with putting humans in space, the 57 years of experience since the Soviets first put a man in space, and also the U.S. Just a month or so later. For many decades, there has been remarkable engineering behind the remarkable safety records we have for both humans on aircraft and humans in space. This engineering has methodically looked at a whole bunch of disruptions that need to be dealt with on a daily basis. You can see here, this is legitimate lightning talk. There is lightning there, but certainly for civilian aircraft, one of the disruptions that is factored into all engineering is weather, the natural environment, hardware failures and software failures. We've heard earlier today about RF environment, spectrum, and those kinds of issues, obstacles, human error. And a similar set is addressed in the engineering for space missions, a little tailored to the different operational environment. We don't worry so much about micrometeors and orbital debris for aircraft. What's new? Well, in recent years, I think we've actually heard quite a bit about what's similarities of what's new in civil aviation, resiliency, engineering, and civil space. One of the big things that is new, or at least a greatly growing threat, is with man-made threats, cyber, for instance, as well as the threat of intentional disruption of radio systems. Another development that I don't think we've heard much about today, but I suspect we will this afternoon, is with the inevitable shift in responsibility between the human and the machine in both civil aviation and in civil space. What's going on in the civil aviation world with respect to these? Well, regarding cyber, there has been a lot of work in recent years. As the computers on board aircraft and ground systems grow in responsibility, and also in a number of connections to the external world, the threat of cyber is exponentially growing today. The FAA recently convened an aviation rulemaking advisory committee that did come up with a number of recommendations just last year on how to deal with this threat. There have also been new standards on how to deal with these threats that have emerged from the usual standards bodies within the aviation world that may be of interest to those of you that are working on civil space systems. For radio frequency threats to communication, navigation, surveillance, this is an interesting subject, one that the acting administrator talked about a little bit earlier. Traditionally, in civil aviation, one of the difficulties we're facing now is that it has been open and transparent, as NASA has been, in terms of engineering threats and what's done to address threats. And that gets to be very difficult when you talk about man-made threats. Because if you well describe threats and what needs to be done to address them, in some ways you're giving someone the video after the pomegranate one that one of the first speakers today spoke about how to actually do harm to folks. So that is a very hot topic in our community in civil aviation today. To deal with such threats today, mostly what's being done is through systems of systems approaches. For instance, air navigation service providers around the world for civil aviation are keeping traditional ground nav aids. That is our version of Fortran and COBOL that was talked about earlier today, our kryptonite to intentional threats, because they're old and they are super high-powered analog systems that are harder to defeat with such threats as backups to GPS and other low-powered digital systems. Aviation has a very tough challenge because everything is open and out there, so all of the links that an aircraft gets for communications, navigation, surveillance today from ground or other aircraft are all open architecture, essentially. Everyone knows the waveforms, the protocols and the like, and thus it's not hard to disrupt or spoof them. Someday, I think we will move towards using some of the mechanisms that the military uses to protect such systems, cryptography and the like. But it is a challenge because you do want to have aircraft fly around the world, so it makes it hard to share keys with only a limited community. The last challenge that I wanted to talk about today and what's being done in the civil aviation world, I think you'll see in civil space as well, this is this continual increase in automation. For years in civil aviation, this was done simply to deal with complexity. A modern aircraft may have over 6 million lines of code today, and some civilian aircraft have over 6 million parts. It gets very hard for a human to control such a beast. So over the years, a lot of functions on the aircraft have become more and more automated, as have the ground systems and space systems that are used to orchestrate flights. We are seeing today a huge effort to try and integrate remotely piloted vehicles in civilian airspace. This is a tremendous challenge today. And I think in the far term, we're going to see a continuation of this trend towards automation to the point where we're in the Star Wars world of having fully autonomous aircraft carrying passengers around. As a nervous passenger, I don't look forward to that day, but I think it is inevitable. So anyways, these are the developments I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your attention after lunch, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? I'm Chris Davenport. I'm a reporter, and we've got the next panel here, Resilience in Commercial Space Launch. First, want to say thanks to Todd and the team at CSIS for having us here. We really appreciate it. Let me just do quick introductions of our panel, and then we'll be off and running. Right here to my left is Dan Hart, the president of Virgin Orbit. Before coming to Virgin, he had spent 34 years at Boeing, where he was vice president of their government satellite systems. Next to him is Tom Chuddy, the vice president and general counsel at the United Launch Alliance, that joint venture between Lockheed Martin and Boeing. Before joining ULA, he was a senior vice president and general counsel for ILA International Launch Services, and also had a similar position at Lockheed Martin. And last but not least is Josh Gross, the Senior Director of Government Business Development for SpaceX, leading the company's development efforts with the United States civil and national security customers. I thought before we got into the Q&A, we'd just sort of let the three panelists take a few minutes each to sort of talk about resilience in commercial space and what that means to them and how they view that. And I wondered, Dan, if you might take it away for us.
Sure. Let's see. First of all, for those of you who are not familiar with us, Virgin Orbit was established as a separate company about a year ago, and our focus is launching small satellites into low Earth orbit, and small meaning 300 to 500 kilograms. And it's an interesting time in the industry for that class of spacecraft. We really passed a tipping point over the last few years where the density of electronics, the maturity of electric propulsion, technologies like laser communications and phased array capabilities have really allowed small satellites to perform a lot of heavy lifting in low Earth orbit. And so that's spawning ideas and investment in the commercial world. So on the commercial side of space, you have an enormous amount of entities popping up that in years past, because of the funding needed to get into space, would not ever have been possible. So if you were at the Small Satellite Conference this year in Logan, Utah, for instance, you would have found 2,700 people in that small town at a conference that probably 10 years ago might have had 300 people. If you were to walk down the aisles, anybody with a little bit of knowledge of satellites would have been able to say, okay, well, there's my IMU, there's my propulsion system, and there's my payload, and they could have put it at the end of the conference into a package about the size of a shoebox. I mean, the amount of product and the amount of investment is huge. The maturity of the customers now is getting more and more, where these customers traditionally, and very often still, travel as second passengers on, well, on rockets that my friends to the left provide. They're getting more demanding because their businesses are getting more real. And so they're now wanting service on time on a specific orbit, not just to be left off and maybe drift over for months. And that spawned a new set of businesses and a launch need. And when they put up their constellations, and there are many constellations of the 100 to 200 up to the thousands, they will need personalized service to orbit when they need replacements, when they need to deal with debris in their orbits. And those are the areas where Virgin Orbit comes into play, where we can put up 1, 2, 8 satellites at a time of these small sizes and give these folks their business. That responsiveness that we can provide for the commercial sector, just change a few words, and it is all relevant to the national security world. Because responsiveness to orbit, the ability to use small satellites for proliferated constellations and specialized missions is something that's very much in the conversation through the U.S. government, with leading edge organizations like DIUX, like AFRL, and NASA, looking at ways to make use of small satellites, do things much less expensively and effectively. And our launch system, which is in development, we launched in the middle of this year, is geared to taking that market and serving the government side as well.
Good. Tom?
Good. Well, resiliency in the commercial market, to me, and I'm well into my third decade in the commercial launch arena, is having products. I mean, it's market driven, right? You need to address what the market needs, or else you're going to be out of the market. So it's important that you have a product that's reliable, a product that's on time, and a product that's affordable. Now, you know, ULA, as was mentioned, is a joint venture between Lockheed Martin and Boeing. And Boeing inherited the McDonnell Douglas system. So you have great heritage systems of Delta and Atlas. And in the early years, we serviced the commercial market. We put up most of the early commercial satellites, probably 160 early commercial launches. Then with the formation of ULA, it was very important for us to focus on the national security market. And we've had great success there. We've had 124 launches and all 124 successes. I mean, the focus there had to be on absolute reliability. When you're putting up, you know, satellites that are worth, you know, billions of dollars, it has to be a success. Now we're seeing the changes in the marketplace, and it is a really exciting time. There's a lot of new entrance into space, the development of the cislunar environment, and we're really focused now on our Vulcan rocket, which is going to have the reliability and on-time performance that Atlas and Delta systems have shown over the years, but at a very affordable price. And we're very excited about that entry, and we'll be looking forward to launching in mid-2020. And again, I think resiliency in the marketplace also requires partnership with the government. And we've gotten, you know, great support from the Air Force, from FAA in terms of making sure that the management of commercial systems is well done, that we have access to the ranges, that we can guarantee the commercial customers, you know, on-time performance because of the ability to work with the government there. You know, other aspects, you know, we compete on an international market in the commercial arena, so we got to deal with what other governments are doing for their competitors. Ariane provides a very robust COFAS financing program. We're looking forward to things being worked out with the Ex-Im Bank so that, again, we can get the support there. But it is a real important partnership that's important for the government too, because it reduces the impact of fixed costs, which will impact the pricing at the government level, and it just helps make the industry stronger, which is more jobs and all the benefits that come with that.
Great. Josh?
All right. Excuse me. I'd like to start by thanking CSIS and MITRE Corporation for putting together this great event today. As I look at this, I need to roll back the clock to when SpaceX was founded. We're a relatively young company, and when we were founded in 2002, if you looked at the industry, it was really, the global industry was by governments and for governments. The kind of joke at the time Elon started SpaceX, with this vision of rapidly expanding access to space, the joke was the way to become a millionaire in space was to start as a billionaire and start a space company. As SpaceX developed over the years, working on this with this very innovative kind of startup culture, using an iterative approach, we started with the Falcon 1 to really get our kind of feet wet in the launch market, and then we expanded to the Falcon 9, and shortly thereafter introduced the Dragon capsule, which was the first privately developed spacecraft able to take meaningful cargo to space and back. And if you look at the following years, as SpaceX has become more successful, you're seeing lots of other startups become more and more successful as well, and more money flowing to the industry. And that's leading to this time that's kind of more exciting than any time, at least in my lifetime, within the space industry, where you see every single major launch service provider is developing a new launch vehicle today. There are dozens of small launch vehicles being developed today, and I can't even count the number of small spacecraft companies that are, been funded recently. And if you look at what resiliency means, I think you can look to the successes that have happened in the last few years in the industry. And resiliency comes from having a sustainable, competitive marketplace where there isn't just one provider doing everything. You need to have multiple people with different solutions competing for the business on an ongoing basis. So if you roll back the clock to when the COTS agreement was let, where SpaceX and Orbital were given contracts to develop the ability to take cargo to the space station, many people didn't think commercial companies could do that. They thought that was something that only governments could do. And out of that program, you saw two very different solutions for how you get cargo to the space station and back, two brand new launch vehicles that have, again, led to this kind of resilient architectures for cargo, which, again, that same model can play out in many different places within space. And I think as we look forward, looking at all the different developments people on this panel and others in the industry are making, again, it's the most exciting time I've seen in history.
Great, I really appreciate that. I just want to remind folks that if you want to ask a question, we will be taking them. You have to do that online, so feel free to submit your questions. But first, moderator's prerogative, I'm going to start with a few of my own. And I want to start with Dan because you offer a different solution in that you're in both the vehicle, because a Launcher One is an air launch vehicle, and sort of the market that you're going after. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Launcher One, the resiliency of an air launch and the flexibility it gives you, and then a little bit about that small satellite marketplace that you're going over, because as Josh was talking about, there's a lot of competition, and a lot of competition too, even in that marketplace too. So I wonder if you could give us the lay of the land there.
Sure. So first of all, a little more about our system. So our system is air launched, meaning we carry the rocket up under the wing of a 747 aircraft. We fly out and release the rocket and over sea, and a few seconds later the rocket ignites and takes the payload up to orbit. That gives us a number of interesting advantages. Number one, as far as the physics of rockets, those of you who have worked on rockets, getting out of that lower atmosphere and getting low velocity and altitude is helpful and helps with the propulsion system, the structure. As far as the cost and flexibility, we're not tied to a government range. And so we don't have all of the coordination requirements, scheduling, and some of the equipment that you normally need to carry up that also adds cost and takes, takes time and money out of for the team. So we can, physically we can take off from any airport that can handle a 747. Certainly we have propellants, so we do a fair amount of, and we launch into space. So there's a coordination and licensing activity that we have. But the fact that we really, it's the most reusable first stage, and it's the cleanest pad because we start our engines in midair. So there's no cleanup between launches. We can respond very quickly. We can launch to any azimuth. We can fly a 747 essentially anywhere we want to and release a rocket. And so that allows us to do anything from polar to low inclination and do them very quickly between each other.
When you mentioned, I just want, how quickly?
We could do a couple of launches in a day if we needed to. I mean, just picture what a 747 needs to do. There's obviously fueling we have to do, but again, there's not a big cleanup. There's no equipment that has been vibrated at a launch pad that you have to recertify or something like that. As far as the market goes, it's a growing market, and there's a lot of product in the market right now. Our manifest is for 2018 is full. For 2019, where we want to launch 12 times, is more than halfway full, and for 2020, where we want to double that cadence, we're also about halfway full. So we're seeing a lot of hunger for the need. We do have some competitors. Rocket Lab is working hard, and they're launching. And there's a couple of others. Our philosophy is we wish them well because this is a new part of the market and it needs to have more than one player in it. It's obviously the same thing goes for the spacecraft.
So, Tom, you had mentioned earlier that this is a really exciting time for space, and as someone who writes about space, as a space journalist, it's a really good time to be a space journalist. There's lots of grist for the mill. Yeah. With SpaceX coming on and now competing for these national security launches that ULA had dominated for so long, your CEO, Tory Bruno, has talked about literally transforming the company to compete, and obviously Vulcan's a part of that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what ULA has done in order to compete.
Yep. Again, the focus is on the development of the Vulcan rocket, which is going to provide 20% more lift capacity than the current largest rocket on the Delta Heavy, and that's going to be on a single stick, which means a tremendous reduction in cost. We've already reduced our employee base from 3,500 to around 2,500. We've taken a lot of executive reductions. We've are doing a lot of things to take cost out of the system, but at the same time maintaining the reliability that has been at the forefront of ULA. As we move from currently the two systems, Atlas and Delta, down to one system, that will also help reduce the costs. We'll be reducing pads, and the key is that with the additional lift capacity of Vulcan plus the reduction in cost, we'll be able to reduce quite significantly the pound to or kilogram to orbit cost. And we're going to be addressing all market segments. We're developing a new upper stage. So we've really been great at precisely placing payloads into LEO, MEO, or GEO, but with this new upper stage, we'll be able to move from, drop someone off at LEO and then go on to GEO. And with that kind of performance, we really think the commercial market will respond to that. And we're looking forward to getting back into that game. As I said, Atlas and Delta had the great years in the 90s and the early 2000s, but then we got focused on the national security missions, but we're coming back, and looking forward to competing in that market at a very exciting time when a lot of people need to get, to space cheaply.
Right. So, Josh, when the Vulcan comes online and the Atlas and Delta are phased out, if I'm not mistaken, then the Falcon 9 becomes the American rocket with the longest heritage, right? But it's not capable of fulfilling all of the national security launch missions. For that, obviously, you've got the Falcon Heavy. So I want to ask you a question about that, because we've got a test fire coming up this week maybe, and then perhaps a launch. That seems like an incredibly complicated rocket, 3 cores, 27 engines, and we're talking about resiliency and launch. Once you get that launching at some sort of operational cadence, will that become as reliable and effective as a Falcon 9? I mean, it just seems like it's a very difficult beast. Sure.
So the complexity of that vehicle, as you noted, is a step change from what we've seen with Falcon 9. But as we look at the development of that, we've focused on leveraging as much of the capabilities of Falcon 9 as possible. So we're using the same second stage, the same engines. Even the 3 boosters that are nested together to form the first stage are nearly identical to the first stages on Falcon 9. So you get that common heritage across many of the components, which will naturally drive up the reliability of it. As well, throughout the development of the boosters of it, we're focusing on reusability of the boosters, just like we are for Falcon 9. So when you have reusable boosters and you're getting them back, you're learning more about how those boosters perform and what they see in flight than you could possibly learn on an expendable system. As we look at the launch rate for that, when we developed Falcon 9 and started flying it, we thought that the market was a certain size for it. And what we saw over time is that the unique attributes of Falcon 9, with a large fairing and a low cost to operate, started pulling more and more of the payloads that had historically required a launch vehicle the size of Falcon Heavy onto a Falcon 9 instead. As Falcon Heavy comes into operation, again, you have this brand new capability with a different amount of performance at a different price point than anyone's seen before. And so we'll have to see how the market reacts. But we see it as being a workhorse for national security missions, certainly for interplanetary missions, and for some commercial missions.
So I'll go to one of the questions here and modify it a little bit. The question is, how are we getting to the moon? How could each of your companies contribute to such an effort? So Josh, you guys have pitched a COTS program for the moon, and COTS was sort of the program that led to the development of your cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station, sort of a public-private partnership with NASA. We've seen Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' space company, pitch a program called Blue Moon, which would be a lander. And obviously, Acting Administrator Lightfoot was here, talking a very little bit about plans for the moon. But Josh, I wonder, are you in specific conversations with NASA, SpaceX, into what specifically SpaceX could contribute on a lunar mission? I mean, have you proposed a lander or a lunar spacecraft or anything like that at this point?
Sure. So I think I'll break that into a couple of pieces. So I think the first one is, if you look at what a lunar COTS or a deep space COTS program would look like, you have to look back to what worked so well in the COTS program several years ago. And if you look in the COTS program, what they did is they came out with a certain amount of money and said, this is a capability we need, not a defined solution. So it wasn't your spacecraft must look like this. It was, we need this much mass to this destination, and possibly a return mass capability, and left it up to the contractors to decide what architecture made the most sense to solve that problem. And again, what you saw coming out of that was 2 different solutions between Orbital and ourselves for supplying that cargo, both of which were less expensive than any option that was previously available. And I think the cost savings and the market stimulating effect has been very well identified. If you start looking at what SpaceX could contribute in a COTS to the moon or another deep space COTS, Elon back at the IAC talk was pretty clear about the fact that this BFR that we're developing is really focused on enabling transportation eventually to Mars. But the nearer term destination that makes the most sense is the moon. And so it's being developed to be kind of destination agnostic and have the capability to take meaningful cargo and or people eventually to the moon as well. As far as discussions with NASA, we continue to point to, if you have additional capabilities that you need, again, focus on how you set up the competition to encourage the most competition, the most disparate solutions to that really need that they have.
Tom, where does ULA fit into this? I know Tori's talked a lot about the Cislunar 1000 mission, but what could you guys do to help with the lunar mission?
Yeah. Again, our rockets have the capabilities to do any mission that's required by the U.S. government, and we have. We've gone to every planet, and we clearly could support, any sort of lunar mission, especially with the advanced upper stage. We'll be able to do a lot of different things that have never been done before. Not being an engineer, I'm not going to get into that, but we weren't part of the original COTS missions. However, after there was an Antares failure, a Soyuz failure, and a SpaceX failure, it was necessary to get resources up to space station, and an Atlas was taken, and we were able to take up a double load. So, I mean, we're capable of doing whatever NASA wants us to do or the Air Force wants us to do.
Have you had conversations with NASA? I mean, how involved are you in what they want to do? Or are you going to wait and see what they do before you sort of jump in there?
We always have ongoing, discussions with NASA to service whatever needs that they have. That's the extent of my knowledge on that particular subject.
So Dan, I don't think the moon is quite in.
I've got to disagree there.
All right, great.
We haven't quite figured out how to put people in and get to the moon yet. But we actually have had a number of folks coming with instruments and small comms packages, and we have found with electric propulsion we can get to the moon.
Interesting. There you go. You get a question from Frank Slazer from AIA on you got to take it. I think this one is probably we can go for everyone, whoever wants to take it. What are your most difficult regulatory challenges from the U.S. government, and are they getting better or worse? This one's for Frank. Who wants it?
I would say, since space is a global enterprise, probably some of the international regulations are probably and a lot of them are there for good reasons. So, I mean, you've got to be thoughtful about how you deal with any adjustments to them. But those are challenging in terms of working with foreign governments. I think that we work with the FAA, and we're finding that in general that's been a good process, and things are going very well there.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's been a good partnership. I mean, when you're selling internationally, you have to deal with the State Department to get the appropriate licenses, and the process is well defined and thoughtful. We're getting ready to launch the first astronauts from U.S. soil in over a decade, and well, no, it hasn't been quite that long, but in too long. We're hoping that that'll happen by the end of this year, and of course, there's lots of regulations and oversight going into that, but it's very important process that we're involved in. I mean, we need to make sure that our astronauts are safe. So I think we've been very pleased with the partnership that we've had with the various government agencies that impact space launch.
You don't want that one? You gonna take it?
I'll make just a kind of brief comment. I think as we look at regulations, the ones that we're most keenly focused on in the near term are very tactical ones. So as we approach increasing launch rates, the licensing process we go through for getting launch licenses and launch spectrum licenses are really something that's been set up for one-off activities, not for high-volume kind of activities. And that's something we've been working with the FAA on to try to figure out a more efficient and simpler way of addressing that.
I want to go ahead. Yeah, please.
One go back on that. You know, the one area that I think probably everybody I would think would agree that we can focus on in this is the acquisition process. And back to resilience, you know, what features need to be worked in the acquisition process so that if there's a need that has an urgent timeline, that we are set up and ready to go. And it probably fits across large rockets and small rockets and satellites and the whole rest of the industry. There are probably times that we will see in the future that could be a little different than the past, and where we can move quickly, and if the acquisition process is set up to do so, we'll be able to.
Mm-hmm. Tom had mentioned flying astronauts for the first time since the shuttle was retired in 2011. There was a hearing on the Hill yesterday about this. Maybe start with Josh and then go to Tom. If you could talk a little bit about, you know, what you're doing to keep the astronauts safe, but then also, Josh, you've got a real interesting culture that you had mentioned earlier with SpaceX, and that you're really, you know, hard-charging, innovative, entrepreneurial. And there was a lot of talk during the cargo where you learned a lot from NASA, but NASA also learned a lot from SpaceX. And there's two different cultures that we're mixing there. With human spaceflight and the rigorous oversight of that, I would think there'd be even more, not so much tension, but a collision of there, sort of a culture clash. I wonder if you could take us inside that a little bit and how that's working between SpaceX and NASA on commercial crew.
Sure. So I think I can talk about this in a couple of different steps. So I think on the rocket side of the equation, we've been iterating on our rocket to make it more capable and more reliable over the last several years. The Block 5, which should be flying in the next few months, is seen as SpaceX's final iteration for the foreseeable future to the Falcon 9. And a lot of the upgrades in that version of the rocket are driven based on the requirements of flying crew safely and on meeting all of the final requirements of the ELB program. And we see that rocket design as being the most reliable rocket design in history. As we start to look forward to crew, obviously, you know, crew is a higher bar than satellites, and we've taken that very seriously from the beginning of the design of the Dragon capsule as we've worked through the various safety systems and partnered with NASA to make sure we had a final design that is locked down, that meets each of the requirements. If you look at from a company management standpoint, I think many people believe that innovation and consistent operations are naturally in tension. And I don't think that's really true. I do think in our company we have two strong leaders with different kind of focuses where they really address their energy. If you look at Elon, as he founded this company, he's focused on the innovation engine, on how do you have the greatest capability that you could possibly have, and really driving the engineers to have that ever greater capability. So it drove us to a reusable first stage that we've demonstrated. It drove us to develop Falcon Heavy and other products that are following in the future. On the other side, we've got the president of our company, Gwen Shotwell, who's really focused on this operational excellence side of the equation of how do you build a culture within our 6,000 or so employees that gives consistent performance, mission after mission after mission that is perfect. And by having those two different traits within the senior management of the company, I think it's helped us kind of balance those two needs as we go forward.
Interesting. Tom, I wonder if you would take that question in terms of ensuring crew safety and how you are working with NASA to do that. Yeah. And then also, I mean, obviously you've got sort of a long heritage, that you can draw from with Boeing and Lockheed. But it's been a long time since the United States has flown astronauts. There's a concern, that people will say that NASA has gotten very risk averse. And, at some point the safest thing is just not to fly. How do you balance within ULA, that sort of, how do you balance risk management? That at some point you've got to go, and you can't be completely 100% safe.
Yep. Well, again, we have a heritage of 100% reliability, 124 out of 124 launches since organization was stood up, and our focus is on engineering. And you mentioned about the Vulcan rocket being a new rocket. Well, it's bringing the best systems from both Atlas and Delta to one rocket. And I mean, there will be a transition period, so you're not going to just automatically switch over to Vulcan. Just wanted to be clear on that. Again, I mean, it's engineering and it's process, and I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, you look at our record, and it is the best, by far the best in the industry, by far the best in the U.S. Systems, and we're working with Boeing, who's the prime contractor, building the capsule, and doing all the things that we do to assure reliability, and even more so. I mean, it's one thing, like you said, I mean, billion-dollar satellites are important, but human lives are even more important. And again, working in a close partnership with NASA, this reliability isn't anything new for us. So it's going to be done the way it's been over the last 11 years since we're stood up, and with even more emphasis on safety. But I don't think, I really don't see anything, all that new here. We focus on, 100% performance and on-time performance.
How important is it to be first, to fly, to be the company that restores U.S. human spaceflight for NASA?
Most important thing is to be safe. And again, I think with the systems that we have in place, we will be first because we have the background and experience and capability.
I'll take one from the tablet. Do you see that there's enough worldwide market to allow each of you to be profitable, as well as other American and foreign competitors? How important is a robust commercial demand versus government contracts as your company's driving income stream? I wonder, Dan, if you'd take that, since you had started to talk a little bit about your manifest and how it's already booking up, and I think you just signed a new customer within the last couple of days.
Yeah, GomSpace from Denmark. Well, so we do see a growing market in the small satellite world. And there are interesting things happening in LEO, in MEO, and in GEO in the commercial world. We've had the new digital payloads and high capability analog payloads in GEO, and now we have a whole set of satellites being developed for LEO, and I think that the industry is learning how to use both, and there's interaction across the spectrum. Matter of fact, in LEO there are some satellite systems being developed to serve satellites that they're not pointed down, they're pointed up, storing data, laser communication links, and a variety of services. So we see the market growing. For us, it's starting in the commercial world. It's a commercially led transformation. We see the government through programs like VCLS, like DIUX, is starting to now practice in the acquisition side and get involved and experiment. And certainly they've been experimenting on ESPA rings for a number of years. So we see the commercial world as leading. It's a growing market that needs a couple of more players for specific concierge service to orbit, if you will. But then we see the government coming online as well as they as these platforms are funded by the private sector. The government will take advantage of them, and the discussions that we've had are very encouraging.
Well, and what's driving so much of the growth is this small satellite revolution. There's all this talk. SpaceX wants to do it. One of your customers, OneWeb, wants to put up constellations of these satellites. But there's a lot of orbital debris that became a big thing if we're talking about resiliency with commercial crew. What the NASA advisory, the safety panel, brought that up. What are the concerns about just congestion in low Earth orbit in terms of resiliency? I mean, is that something that needs to be addressed last week?
It's going to need to be congestion. I mean, traffic control is going to need to be addressed in low Earth orbit. We're going to need much more of an infrastructure than we do today, and we need it for traffic control for low Earth orbit. We need it for situational awareness, for resiliency in a national security sense too. So we really need to do more. Certainly JSPOC does a great job with the resources they have, but we'll need to grow that. As far as is there room in low Earth orbit for a lot of satellites? Yes, there's room.
Space is big.
Space is big. There are a few billion people on Earth, and we somehow have an ability to navigate around each other. But we do that with sensors and positive control. Debris, we think that there will be a business in, we've talked about this for years. We think there will be a business for dealing with debris. That's honestly an interesting niche that we're starting to follow, track, and try to enable, because they will need point of service, launch.
One of the keys too, Tom, I wonder, because Tori Bruno talks about this, and you had mentioned it, that there'll be a market for debris. But when do we get that point, or what will it take for there to be a true self-sustaining economy in space where you're not so reliant on the government as a customer? And what's it going to take for us to get that? Because then I think once you have that, then you can have the sort of routine, reliable, and the resiliency that we're all, I think everyone's trying to get at.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, we are sort of at almost akin to an industrial revolution in terms of settling space. We're at the very beginnings of that. We were talking to lots of venture capitalists, smart startups that have lots of great ideas, from pharmaceuticals to mining asteroids to mining the moon to doing a lot of different things. And for so long we were sort of in a doldrums. I mean, we put a man on the moon in 1969, and certainly when I was growing up, I thought, boy, there'd be a whole lot of things that would happen by the time I got to my ripe old age. But it's just, and I do give kudos to startups like SpaceX that have been disruptors and are driving down the cost of getting to space, which is going to enable business plans to close and a lot more things to start happening in space. But it's hard for me to set a timetable to that, again, our big focus too is on national security space, where I think, as Speaker Ryan this morning talked about, China, Iran, North Korea. I mean, there's a lot of things there that we're focused on from a national defense, which is sort of first and foremost of our missions. I can't guess when when we hit 1,000 people working in space. I guess is when the cislunar economy really starts to take off. It could be a decade from now, but I'll turn that question over to someone who could have a more realistic answer.
Josh, do you want to try it?
Sure. So I think if you look at what a resilient company looks like in space today versus what it may look like in the future, those are going to be different answers. I think today we break down the market into three main segments. You've got the civil space market, the national security space market, and the commercial/international government market. And I think each one of those markets goes in cycles. And so to be a truly resilient company, you need to be competitive in all three of those. So on the commercial side, it's kind of price first and capability second. On the national defense side, it's really capability first. You have to meet all of their different requirements, for mass to orbit, reliability, all of those things. And civil space is very similar to the national security space market to that respect. I think as we look to the future, if the commercial industry continues growing at the rate it is, it could be a very different setup that's required for resiliency. But today it's really, you have to be able to play in all three all the time.
Dan, you had mentioned national security launch, and I think you'd mentioned DIUX a couple of times. That's the Pentagon's office in Silicon Valley, and I think they have one in Boston, to try to reach out to smaller, innovative firms to get them to partner. How big is a customer? I mean, do you envision the national security market will be for Virgin Orbit?
Well, let's see. I'm not. We discuss and argue with each other periodically what the percentages are going to be. But again, I see that the development will be the next couple of years. I think the government will experiment more and more with small satellites, and then you know, it's just a natural progression that, for reasons of to proliferate capabilities across the globe, as General Hyten said in the press recently, to something about no more juicy targets, I think was his quote. There are just some natural reasons to have lots of small capabilities versus one big one that can be targeted. And so I see the national security world will do that. From a cost point of view, the price point will be is pretty low. So, you know, as more and more sophistication on small instruments and capabilities on small satellites, I think NOAA and NASA will naturally migrate there also, and it'll help them do more with less money.
One from the online for all of you. Where do you see commercial space launch, particularly in the U.S., 10 years from now?
Well, I would see significant growth. Again, you know, as you lower the cost of access to space, as I said, you know, more business plans will close and more people will, you know, avail themselves of you know, all the benefits that you can get from accessing space, and, you know, anywhere from tourism to, you know, pharmaceuticals, mining. Just had, you know, very interesting pioneers out there. You have the Robert Bigelows of the world that are looking into habitats where you know, ordinary people would get to go up and experience you know, rotating around the Earth. I mean, it's a lot of exciting possibilities.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of build off of that and say, it is such an exciting time in the industry right now. In a decade from now, I don't expect the industry to look anything like it does today. I think, you know, it's just been about 2 years since we landed our first stage for the first time. And prior to that, most people in this room and most people in the industry would have said a reusable first stage was not a highly likely outcome. Now that we've done it, and Blue Origin's investing in it, and others are talking about reusable systems, the industry's starting to shift to where reusability is going to be the solution. Now, SpaceX is starting to work on a fully reusable upper stage as well as part of our long-term architecture. And when that comes to fruition, you get to a cost to get to orbit that enables all sorts of solutions that never would have occurred to people previously. If you look at it, if you roll back the clock and you look at when we started flying Falcon 9, if you'd gone to the people building spacecraft at that time and said, how many spacecraft would you launch per year if your launch was free? You're looking at the traditional geocom satellites. The number of additional launches would not have been that high because the launch was a small portion of that total cost. But all of those solutions were built off the fact it was expensive to get to space. And so I think, you know, the space economy just has huge potential that's untapped at this point that can be unlocked with these fully reusable systems.
Dan, 10 years.
You know, I mean, I think of, well, how many ways are there to use data? You know, a few years ago we were excited because we could send each other email. My kids get out of, you know, their patience if the video that might be 3D video doesn't come within, you know, a couple of seconds. And then VR is coming up, and soon we'll be able to send our experiences to each other on virtual reality. And space sort of reflects that because it handles all that data and it creates data. So, you know, 10 years from now, there will be, you know, the expectation on bandwidth that we can transport will be enormous. The form factors that they can be that can be handled will be different than anything we can think of now, because of Moore's law and other laws. And space transportation will start to finally feel like a normal course of business versus a major, heart-stopping event. That would be my prediction.
Playing off that a little bit, can you talk a little bit about that future? I mean, because I know OneWeb is a big customer of yours and one that you work with closely, and their goal is to essentially beam the internet to all over the world from space. And I know that's a big goal of Richard Branson's as well. Take us a little bit into that future, and once that's up and running, what that looks like.
Well, for OneWeb, and of course there's a couple of constellations that are pursuing similar objectives. You know, the interesting thing is we've grown up in space kind of regional, and a lot of the bandwidth is naturally pointed towards areas that have money and have people and urban areas and so forth, and there's been a lot of writing about the digital divide. One thing about Richard is, and of course he's our founder, Richard's purpose is, I mean, the tagline on his website is changing business for good, and he drives purpose into every business that he's involved in. And so the idea of treating communication globally to where anybody in the globe has an equal ability to communicate with anybody else is extremely interesting. And it will, you know, it should short circuit to some extent the digital divide and present opportunity and growth throughout the globe, and that's the idea.
Josh, I'm going to apologize in advance. We've got one from Irene Klotz, our good friend from Aviation Week. Hi, Irene. Always good to have something from you. The culture of SpaceX has been to continually tweak and improve the design and operability of its vehicles and systems, a process that runs counter to NASA and the Air Force's desire for a stable and reiterated configuration. With commercial crew and the Air Force EELV, the National Security Missions, coming up this year, will SpaceX still be able to improve its designs and operations?
Sure,
so continue to iterate.
Yeah, so I spoke to this a bit earlier. I think if you look at on the Falcon 9 side, which is becoming the workhorse for national security and for civil space, Block 5, which is going to fly in the next few months, is seen as our last iteration on that vehicle. And that's one we have to, you know, it's been upgraded to meet all of the final requirements for commercial crew or national security, space missions. And then the intention is to lock that one down and fly it at very high rates to yield a very stable, reliable system for national security and for astronaut launches. As we look at innovating toward the future, you know, Elon has made some announcements about our next generation launch system, which we're going to start working on to follow the Falcon 9. And that'll follow an innovative cycle, much like Falcon 9 did earlier in its days. And once that is proven to be as reliable or more than Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, it'll become a viable solution for those same kind of missions. But really, it's, you know, the focus is let's lock down our system on Falcon 9, make that our workhorse for now for these, you know, very risk sensitive missions until we have something else.
But so you were just referencing the BFR there, and he's already sort of revised that plan. I mean, I know it's at this point it's on paper.
Sure.
Does that stand sort of where it is now, or is there any update on that you could provide?
No, we don't really have any updates following what he announced last fall. The team continues to work on it to have it be a viable product in the next several years.
And Tom, playing off that with the development of Vulcan, is that, I mean, you haven't yet picked the engine for it, but is the architecture essentially set, or is that something that you'll continue to evolve?
Well, we've gone through our first, you know, CDR on that. We do have a second planned. Obviously, yeah, there hasn't been a down select on the engine yet, but we would anticipate that this year. And I think we feel very comfortable with the design of the rocket, but again, we are Engineering is first and foremost, and reliability. So we'll continue to test and make any changes that would be necessary.
So Dan, I think we started with you, and maybe we'll end with you. I know you had an engine test on Launcher 1 and a fairing test. Can you give us an update on how that's progressing?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually performed a number of qual tests over just the last few weeks. We had a nice long duration test of our first stage. We've done full duration and as well as restarts with our second stage. We did our payload accommodations, structural qual recently today up at Mojave. We're loading, we have our first rocket that we produce out of our factory, and we're loading propellant into it as a launch rehearsal with the launch crew and all the launch equipment. So we are very busy, and we're also flight testing our aircraft. We've modified the wing to carry the load, and that's in flight test. So those are the main areas, and the team's performing just really well. And they're an agile team. So we got a little bit of work to do, and look forward to a flight a little later this year.
So you think you'll actually do a test flight with the rocket this year?
Yes.
No. And operational 2019?
No, operational this
operational
year. I mean,
this year.
we'll have an aircraft and a rocket that will do aerodynamic testing, and then we'll put a flight rocket and we'll do a launch middle of this year.
Well, that's a good place to end. It's going to be a really interesting year with commercial crew and EELV and the government launches and the small sat launches. I'd like to thank our panelists and remind everyone we can have a 5-minute coffee break out in the back. But again, thanks to the panelists. We appreciate it, guys. Yeah, thank you.
In early August, North Korea threatened to launch 4 intermediate-range ballistic missiles to a point about 30 or 40 kilometers off the coast of Guam. Tom, could you walk us through how U.S. missile defense systems would respond if such a launch was detected?
So if that happens, the United States would first detect the missile's heat signatures with satellites such as the Defense Support Program or the newer space-based infrared system. Those satellites would then cue terrestrial radars, such as the TPY-2 X-band radars in Japan and South Korea, which track the missiles with greater precision. The threat missiles would be within the radar field of view for perhaps 5 or 6 minutes. Aegis BMD ships might also be in position to track the missile's flight.
The trajectory of the missiles headed from North Korea to Guam would take them over the southern part of Japan. They'd fly just south of Hiroshima, and at that point they'd be at an altitude of about 700 kilometers. So, Tom, if the U.S. determined that these missiles were actually a threat to Guam, what systems would be called upon to respond?
If the U.S. determines the missiles to be a potential threat, we might try to shoot them down using various missile defense interceptors. This might include the sea-launched Standard Missile-3, launched from an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, or a land-based THAAD battery based in Guam, or some combination of the two. Both systems have an excellent test record, but neither has been used in an operational context against a ballistic missile fired in anger.
And all of this would happen within a relatively short period of time. So North Korea said it would take about 17 minutes time of flight to reach Guam. Others have said it could take as little as 14 minutes. Of course, it depends on the specific trajectory used. A more lofted trajectory would take longer and rise to a higher altitude in space, while a more shallow trajectory would take a bit less time and stay at a lower altitude.
So an intercept attempt with an Aegis Standard missile would be outside the atmosphere, close to its apogee during its midcourse, or during its downward descent with the THAAD system.
So all of this provides an interesting case study into how such a scenario could unfold and the way U.S. missile defense systems are designed to protect against such threats.
Right. This is the kind of threat that we've seen coming for a long time. This is why the systems are located where they are, the radars and the interceptors, but we hope we don't have to use them. To learn more about both the threat missiles from North Korea and the various missile defense systems, check out missilethreat.csis.org.
While much of the world focuses on terrorism in the Middle East, violent extremist groups have expanded their ambitions and reach in Africa as well. In the Western Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has produced or inspired a proliferation of extremist groups that continue to destabilize the region. In the areas around Lake Chad, Boko Haram, with its origins in northeast Nigeria, has left tens of thousands of civilians dead and displaced almost 3 million people. The security vacuum in Libya, and the presence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda deepen the risks to the Sahel region.
There has been a lot of turmoil and trouble with these radical elements, which you find in this arc of instability from North Africa to Afghanistan.
Military intervention by regional forces, France, and the UN have weakened these groups and reclaimed territories they once held. But the drivers of militancy and the complex social, economic, and political environment that fuels these groups remain very much intact. Unless this understructure of vulnerability and criminality is addressed, extremist violence will remain an enduring threat to the region.
I'm Christy Turlington Burns, founder and CEO of Every Mother Counts, and I'm a member of the CSIS Task Force on Women's and Family Health. I joined this effort because I believe our country has a role to play in saving the lives of vulnerable women and children around the world. For the last 18 months, we have worked hard to build a vision for the United States to lead. We believe the moment is ripe for a new initiative to unlock the potential of adolescent girls. Too often, girls and young women in the developing world fall through the cracks, facing early marriage, unintended pregnancy, gender-based violence, and exploitation. But we know that when girls are healthy and educated, they become leaders. They contribute to their economies, have healthy families, and build stronger communities and countries. In turn, Americans benefit from a safer, more prosperous world. We believe that we have a cost-effective and forward-looking proposal that Americans of all stripes can support. Our plan builds on a record of long-standing global leadership by the United States. We would focus on 13 low-income countries with great need and existing investments in areas important to the health and well-being of women and girls. We would spearhead new goals in 4 areas: maternal and newborn health, family planning, nutrition, and vaccination against HPV to prevent cervical cancer. These are key services that are commonplace in the United States, ones that benefit women and girls in a major way. We have also focused on how to get things done, guided by the principles of efficiency, accountability, and partnership. We call for the leadership by the Secretary of State, USAID, and country missions, as well as high-level diplomacy to ensure that the U.S. does not go it alone. We demonstrate the need for better data, new innovations, integration of services, and an expanded role for the private sector. And we note the importance of sustained financial backing from the U.S. and our key partners. We've put forth a bold agenda because it will take big ideas and new approaches to help millions of girls and women living in poverty to realize their true potential. It holds the promise of changing the world for the better, a signature achievement for the Trump administration and the United States. I hope that as a country, we can unite to make this vision a reality.
least I brought the sun in Arizona. Yesterday I landed, I was shocked. You know, I went from the mid-70s. You're right.
All right, if folks could begin taking their seats again, we will get started here in just a moment. All right. Well, I want to go ahead and kick off our third panel discussion of the afternoon. Again, I'm Todd Harrison from here at CSIS. The focus of this panel is we're going to get down another level, get a little more technical, talk about how do you engineer resilience into civil space systems. And so I'm pleased to have such a great group of panelists here. To my immediate left is Dr. Roberto Furfaro, who is Associate Professor at the University of Arizona. He also directs the Space Systems Engineering Lab there. And to his left is Scott Cordello, who's Director of the MITRE National Space Program. And on the end, we have James Norman, who is Director of Launch Services at NASA. And so welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here this afternoon. Dr. Furfaro, I want to start with you. When you think about resilience in space systems, what does that mean to you? And what are some of the policy, but also the engineering challenges into improving the resilience of space and ground systems?
Yes. First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here, actually flying from sunny Arizona. I was in the mid-70s. I'm here to this wonder well. Well, at least seems like I brought the sun here. Well, yeah. That's a good thing. And it's an honor, of course, to serve on this panel and have a discussion with you guys. First of all, I take the perspective from space situational awareness and resilience. The reason is because I'm also director of Space Situational Awareness Arizona, which is under the newly formed Defense and Security Research Institute. Okay, so I take the perspective from space situational awareness, and I liked Chris Haggerty's definition of resiliency. It was taken from INCOS, and what I noticed that for a lot of reasons, there is especially from the NASA perspective, there's a lot of interplay between resiliency and safety, right? So I like to have a little bit of the way I interpret resiliency, right? Resilience is basically the ability to architect a system that is capable of basically responding adaptively to threats, right, of any sort. That is, you have highest probability of performing seamless across the border. And it's a little bit different than safety, because safety means you have not to fail, while resiliency means the system, if conceived as a system of systems, can fail safely, right? So if some parts fails, then of course you have the system that does interrupt. Now, when you talk about space situational awareness, and a lot of people in other panels touched about this, people are concerned because the space is congested. I would add up also, as our military likes to say, is also contested, okay? That means they try also, there might be nations that try to restrict, your actions, your range, and so on and so on. And so the question is, how do you engineer, these systems? And for SSA, what you need is basically what in Arizona we like to call a layer scalable system. You need different level of hardware that enables measurements of space objects, right? But also, once you do this, you have to have a system that is able to elaborate the data and understand what the object is. And this is not tricky. Everybody's been focusing on the problem of, oh yes, we have to do something for debris. But there is even a basic fundamental problem, that is, how do you distinguish if something is debris or not, okay? And I'm just telling you, we're not resilient in that regard, in the sense that we don't have standards yet in algorithms that can reliably and uniformly across the border make a distinction between these two elements. So there's a lot of there's a lot that we have to do this, and I hope I'll let the others speak, but I hope at least we can elaborate a little bit in this panel about that.
All right, and so Scott, one of the technical advances that we've been seeing is greater use of autonomy in all sorts of systems, but also in space systems and on-orbit operations. From your perspective, what's needed to make sure that autonomy like that can be implemented in a way that is safe and responsible in our space systems?
It's a great question. First, thank you for having me, and just a quick comment. Why are we doing this? Why is CSIS and MITRE hosting this? And I think some of the other panels have talked about this. It's a new time for space. We're at the beginning of a new thing. And we, MITRE, observe that there are lots of very, very smart people doing lots of very important things. But we believe that we need to have more of a conversation like this, that's a systematic conversation around the topic of resilience. That there are so many pieces happening simultaneously that we should not depend on ad hoc conversations. Rather, we should purposefully talk about resilience and draw the connections between national security, civil, commercial, and build more confidence, reuse, and leverage, as others have said. So that's just a quick commercial why we're doing this, and the invitation to have more of these conversations and to have us be part of these conversations jointly. So now to your question about autonomy, and others have spoken about this, the self-driving car. Would you be a passenger in a self-driving car? Or the self-driving airplane that Chris spoke about? Autonomy is coming, whether we like it or not. And so what do we do with it? And what does it mean regarding resilience? And so I talk about the information enterprise. I think of information as the commodity we're all using. Space is a contributor to that. Air is a contributor to that, and so on. And in our view, MITRE, in a real sense, in an abstract sense, but in a tangible sense, space is no different than these other domains. It's a contributor, and it's not different than traffic cams or the web or what have you. And so what are the practices that we use for those other systems that we can bring to bear to the space domain? And one of those is autonomy and the use of autonomy. So very quickly, what does that mean? There are things that space vehicles can do autonomously, and increasingly they do, without talking to the ground. How do we build trust that they'll do the things that we want them to do? The ground is autonomously processing data from space sources, other sources, and pushing products out. How do we build more autonomy? At some point, the human has to intervene and make important decisions, but all the other mundane stuff can be automated. What are those points of intervention? Where does the human have to intervene? And when can we automate? That, to us, is a very, very important question. And then, how do we build resilience into the machine to do the things we expect it to do when it's needed? That's the idea. So what I say is build it, use it, automate it. Build it means integrate the information into a domain that you can use to address problems. Use it, do business with it, conduct operations with it. And once you understand it, automate it. And that, to us, I think, is the evolution of where we're going in space.
All right. And Jim, I want to come to you. And you've got a different angle here. Your focus is on space launch. And You just heard the previous panel. From your perspective, what can you tell us about what is NASA doing to make space launch more resilient?
Again, thank you for the invitation here today to speak. I appreciate the previous two panelists' comments on the definition of resiliency as well. I think the context of speaking about it matters greatly. And I thank you for setting it up with this particular question for me. I think my acting administrator gave a good point on this talking earlier. When he was addressing resiliency and then addressing that in terms of risk management and striking an appropriate balance, he also talked about how in some areas NASA is going to lead, in some areas NASA is going to collaborate, in other areas NASA is going to leverage. And I would posit perhaps resiliency may have different applications or different definitions depending on which of those three phases we're talking about. Maybe one construct is NASA is leading in deep space human exploration and is managing the development of that system. Perhaps NASA is collaborating with industry for commercial crew as we move into that realm for commercial flight of astronauts to and from the International Space Station. The group that I represent has been leveraging industry for a while in terms of the launch of our scientific missions, taking our high-value satellites to space and probes to Mars and so forth and so on. So I think what NASA's doing is thinking about it both at an engineering level and at a risk management level and an application level, depending on the context that we're talking about. I don't think there's one broad brush, and I don't think that there is one static risk posture.
Okay. I want to come back to where we started here. Roberto and others, please feel free to jump in. What we see on the horizon in the space industry is we've got commercial companies mainly that are planning some really large constellations. Not just the microsats and CubeSats, but even larger satellites going up in constellations, potentially hundreds and thousands of satellites in some of these high-density constellations. What kind of challenge does that pose? Not just for space situational awareness, but also space traffic management. And how do those problems scale, especially if the cost of access to space is coming down, becomes more affordable, some more business cases are going to close, we could see more and more of these constellations going up. What does that do to the problem?
Well, there are a lot of challenges. Initially, space situational awareness, which is focused specifically on characterizing, understanding, identifying, the objects, focus mostly on observations, right? You deploy, a bunch of assets and you take measurements and then somehow you figure out what the object is doing and then you take custody of those, right? And you just keep tracking, do catalog maintenance and so on and so on. But as you said, as the space, as the more and more objects are launched into orbit, then it becomes a big data problem. Okay. What it means we have to have the ability to process reliably, data and get and tease out information out of that. Now, one of the most important things that I believe is critical, and actually, as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why, in Arizona we started this program in space situational awareness that can eventually extend and tackle the space management, space traffic management program, is that we have a cyber infrastructure called Cybers, which is coming from $100 million investments from NSF to manage big data problems in life science. Then we went to the Air Force and we said, we do believe we need something like that in SSA. And the reason is because you have to have a data management system that is shareable, that contain knowledge base that is also shareable and also customizable, right? That can be shared across all the different people, the different players that are into the, into the space business, right? So the challenge there is to develop algorithms that can really process this kind of data and share information about it. At this point, I would say that the space, to a certain degree, is kind of a little bit of a Wild West, right? I mean, you have even emerging nations, thinking about now Nigeria, right? Recently, Nigeria developed space programs. We have actually our neighbor Mexico's more and more interested in actually putting stuff up with the relatively newly formed Mexican Space Agency, right? And reality is that anybody at this point can put something in orbit, can put a rock in orbit, and there is no regulation or nothing. And as a matter of fact, if you think about also the amount of things that we are tracking, the Space Command is tracking about somewhere between 22 and 25,000 objects. But we're talking about that we believe there are something like 500,000 around, okay? And these things is growing and growing and growing. Not to speak about, dead objects that, for which we don't even know, for example, what is the effect, what the space environment really does to them in terms of, even material degradation, delaminations, right? So it can break up apart and change the properties that can even observe. So on one side, you have the challenges that you have to have resilient, multimodal observing platforms, right? For example, again, at my university, we have the Stewart Observatories, which has something like 22 telescopes, large scale, mostly tuned for near-Earth objects and astrophysics type of things. But we are complementing that with, a set of network of more smaller objects that can track rapidly object in LEO, right? So the idea is try to cover as much as you can, right? For example, the optical regime, or in using other type of regimes. We also have, multi-static radar type of things where we can do inverse SAR for orbit determination. But this is just one level. Then eventually you have to go into the business of inferring intention. And, traditionally, I come from a spaceflight mechanics type of community, right? And the community, conventionally, it's more traditional in the sense that the idea is that I take some measurements, I figure out what is the orbit of the object, and maybe I put some uncertainty on my estimation, that's it. But the question is that, yes, you have an orbit, right? Maybe you can detect even a maneuver, but what are the intentions? How do you infer intentions, right? And not only that, how do you share, how do you coordinate between different, players that maybe don't want to share information about it, right? So that's kind of a little bit of a problem, and these all embedded in a problem, big data problem, where now suddenly, because the problem becomes complex, because maybe the models that we use are not refined enough. Actually, as a matter of fact, we don't have a very good understanding of the full impact of aerodynamic forces or solar pressure forces onto the object, simply because how do you characterize it depends on the attitude, on the size, which is really hard to infer from the ground, right? So the long-term behaviors is really extremely hard to characterize. So now suddenly, however, you get a lot of data. So you can run, for example, this is one of our interests, to machine learning algorithms, based on deep learning, which is connected to the autonomy of the system, right? Where now suddenly you learn from the data in an autonomous systems, and then you try to characterize the system, right? So you see, all these challenges are interconnected. You have a multi-layer system. If you want a real resiliency, you have to have a multi-layer systems, which includes, for example, besides ground-based, also even balloon-based. We're thinking about that, balloon-based observation. The reason why we're thinking is because we're running a mission from NASA. The PI is Chris Walker, a professor at Stewart Observatory. It's called GASTO, which is deploying terahertz instruments on the stratosphere on the Antarctic to look at the galaxy water content across the galaxy. This kind of thing, and in Tucson we have world view, who's the balloon-based company, which has recently been certified by NASA to fly this kind of mission. So you can, and then the third layer that I think about is the space base. So the resiliency means coordinating, assimilate observation from all these platforms, from all different with different type of observation, integrated in a cyber infrastructure that can really process large amount of data in an intelligent fashion.
Well, and Scott, picking up on that, one of the things that we see the Air Force doing is they're fielding a new system called Space Fence that's going to give us much better resolution of objects on orbit, so they can spot objects that are even smaller. Yep. That's great. We'll know what's up there better. The problem, though, is that we're likely to find that we're going to now need to track an order of magnitude or more in number of objects.
Absolutely.
And creates a big problem.
It sure does.
How do we handle that?
Yeah, well, we can certainly buy more processors than we do, and we can invoke more automation than we do. But at some point, I think your point is a really good one, Marco, about intent and identity, not just a piece of metal, but what is that thing and what is it doing? And radars will not tell you, they will give you a look angle into intent, but they won't unambiguously tell you the answer. And so you have to look to other sources of information. I call that hard data, the sensor data, and soft data, the contextual data. Like, I just see NASA launch something because I got a news flash. Now my radar has picked that up. That soft data is now merged with the hard data in an automated sense, and I'm now learning that piece of metal is a NASA launch and I understand it. That chaining of data together is the vision, and one must automate that given the numbers that we're talking about over time. And this is not unique to space, as I say. This is not unique. It happens in many domains. The opportunity then is to tailor it to the space domain and take advantage of the things that have worked and not reinvent them. And one lesson that I have learned is, notionally, if I can describe something to you, I can probably automate it. The question is not, can I automate? The question is, should I automate? What should I automate? And in safety of human life, there may be an inherent human decision that has to be made that we would never automate. And in other cases, there may be mundane things that we will always prefer to automate. And so we need to know the difference between them. And that's the opportunity. That's the challenge.
Jim, I want to go to you with a question looking more at the ground side of launch and launch ranges. NASA obviously has several launch sites, one not too far from here, Wallops Island. But a lot of the launches come out of the Cape. And the Cape is prone to weather. And how does NASA think about resilience in space launch sites? And is there any effort, any thought being given to diversifying a bit more? Some private companies are looking at building spaceports at other locations. How does that factor into NASA and space launch?
So I think that's an interesting question. So broadly, I think we as a nation, are since '98 in the Commercial Space Act have been procuring launch services, and so the launch pad, if you will, Eastern Range and Western Range are leased from the Air Force by the launch service providers. And so certainly it's part of the conversation with the range in terms of the requirements that are necessary for protection environment as a part of the range rules and the range experience. the providers then work directly with the Air Force. When we're talking to the Cape and talking Vandenberg, NASA's not involved in that conversation. At Wallops, NASA is involved in that conversation. And certainly at 39A and 39B, NASA on Kennedy was a part of that and key in defining that. So I think it depends on the circumstance, it depends on the location. I go back to the context of the situation in which you find yourself, as succinctly as I can say it.
Yeah. I want to remind folks, I forgot to remind them earlier, if you've got a question for our panelists, you can go to the website you see here, submit your question. We do have a few questions from the audience that already come in. I'll see if you guys want to take this one. From an engineering standpoint, what are the primary challenges to building an automated lunar lander? And what's there left to engineer?
Shall I start?
Absolutely.
Actually, incidentally, I have a few students that are working on the problem of teaching a spacecraft how to land on the moon, directly using machine learning, right? Which it's, the problem is, connected to that one, right? So the problem is, especially when you want to land on the moon and on Mars and those places, the problem is you have to do it reliably, of course, but the challenge is now pinpoint landing, okay? In the case of Mars, just to give you a rough idea, when we launched the Phoenix mission, which was also led by University of Arizona, the error landing ellipse was around 100 kilometers, right? What it means that you can land anywhere in 100 kilometers radius, ellipse at least for the major axis, which it's a headache in terms of finding a place that you can land safely there, right? But the last one where they implemented, NASA implemented an Apollo-like atmospheric guidance type of things, they reduced the ellipse to 5 kilometers. Okay, so that means anywhere in 5 kilometers you can land. So as you see, what it means, and that's the best that we can do in terms of heritage, right? Now at this point you're saying, I want to send cargo both on the moon, both on Mars, and I have to now suddenly repeatedly, right, send cargoes close by, right, safely, so to speak. So now, coming back to your point of, at certain point we have to decide what to do autonomously, even if there are cargoes, right? My sense in the community is that people would really like to do it, actually would trust more the autonomous machine than really a pilot at a certain point, right? For example, if you think about the Apollo landing, the way we do it, we had a flight system, taken over. There were 3 phases guidance algorithm that would take over. And really, Armstrong was there in the last phase to try and make sure that something goes wrong, right? And, the astronauts like it because it becomes a human, you land because of the human courage and the human, it's part of the human enterprise, right? We're centric, it's not the machine that drives us there. Well, but besides that, I think what we need to really push much more in algorithms that can be adaptive. What it means they can learn and adaptively improve precision of the system. There is a big push, and actually I came forward fairly public with some of my students and start pushing the idea that we have to develop a self-flying spacecraft, okay? A spacecraft that take data and learn and knows on its own, how to activate the thrust to achieve a certain position on the surface. It could be asteroids, could be Mars, could be Moon, and things like that. So the challenge is, I think the techniques are there because we have seen people in the computer science community, doing impressive, things. For example, one of the, I don't know if you have followed, but recently, actually it was a couple of years ago, the DeepMind, the company that was acquired now by Google, came up with a system that called AlphaGo that basically can beat any of the world champions in the game Go. The problem is that the Go is not like chess where you can compute all the possible combination, right? There are more combinations than atoms in the universe, apparently. So the system has to learn on its own. Okay, so there are and now recently they come up with another system that the system play against himself and learn even more. So it's pretty much unbeatable. Okay, so now you're talking about systems that go beyond just being autonomous, but being intelligent and take decision on their own. Okay, now I think that we need this kind of system to really exhibit certain type of performance of the order of the one that we need, that is pinpoint landing and also fuel efficiency, because in space mass is a commodity. So I think we're there. Just we have to have the community push for it, right? Which entitles some risk, because just to give another example here, how do you trust the systems, right? The problem is that the systems that are intelligent, they don't have traditional modes of operation where you can test systematically A, B, C, and D. What you need to do, you have basically by definition infinite modes, right? Because the system adapts and learns on its own. So how do you trust the system? They had the problem, for example, for the F-35 design. I remember listening to a talk from the program manager of the program, and they said, "Oh, how did you test this adaptive system that featured an adaptive controller?" He said, "Oh, we tested to exhaustion of money." Okay, what he means they don't. However, we'll find the ways to trust the system. That's my optimistic view of that.
Here's a cool story, a real quick one. So I went to Australia, and I went to the port of Brisbane. You don't say Brisbane, you say Brisbane. And it's a great example of automation. Port operations, that is, they take containers off of the ships and they put them on, they're called straddle carriers, and the straddle carriers then put the containers on trucks, and the trucks drive out. And if you go to a port in the US, for each crane, you would have something like 25 people. At this place, there are 4. And the 4 are doing the uniquely human things. It's the precision positioning. You have to get this thing exactly where you want it, or else something goes wrong. It's the chain of custody from the ship to the port. They want a human in that custody. And then a couple other guys. I don't recall what they're doing, but they're sort of backfill for the other guys. This is exemplary. And it brings my point out that what is the human inherently needed for? The chain of custody, the legal taking ownership of this thing, and the precision positioning. And then sort of general, the other 2 guys are make sure that the wires are properly connected and solid. Sort of a fail-safe thing. So what does that mean for space? And can we afford to do that? Maybe we can't afford to do that when human life is on the line. But we can afford to do that when we have commodity, small sats, CubeSats. If we lose a few, it's not the end of the world, but it's compelling that we could do that. And so I don't know the answer to the lunar lander question, but it would look something like that. What must the human do? And what can the automation do? One last point. What I find useful as a system engineering company is a systematic way to look at automation. And the transportation world has such an animal. Level 1 through 5 for smart vehicles. We need one for the space community. That way we can talk jointly with others and sort of rally around high degrees of automation that we can all see ourselves in. That's something I believe this community would need.
Well, let me pull on that thread a bit, and any of you feel free to jump in on this, but what kind of policy or governance changes do we need to help be a check in the system here and make sure that different companies, different agencies, different governments understand best practices, learn from each other, because this is ultimately a global environment. We don't want anyone messing it up for everyone else. What kind of structure do we need to put over this? Are there policy changes that we need that we don't have right now?
I guess I'm still struggling with the context to prevent or enable what?
Yeah, you know, to prevent you know, disasters happening on orbit, things like, you know, collisions, you know, disasters happening on launch, loss of systems, you know, to prevent different modes of failure that, especially where there are externalities, where it could affect other people. You want to build more safety into the system, build more resilience into the system. Some of these systems are critical, safety of life.
First of all, you need definitely a space traffic management agency. Now, my understanding is that FAA is trying to, you know, step up, right? Or either that or is forced to do that. The problem is that, in my opinion, the level of complexity in space is higher than, not necessarily in volume at this point, because of course we have the traffic management, you know, air management, you know, it's pretty high in volume. I guess the complexity stays in the fact that we do not have a good understanding of the space environment yet. We don't have a good understanding of the measurements that we take of the objects, because, as I said, most of them are far away and we don't have enough resolution to just see a picture of it, right? We don't understand also how they behave when operated by humans, in the sense, yes, the human can execute certain maneuvers, but one of the questions, and actually this was one of the topic of Air Force SBIR that was trying, you know, to push the community, the commercial community, small business community into this direction, is that, okay, it takes a maneuver, so, but what does that mean? What is it doing? What is the spacecraft doing? Connected to the fact that if you don't have a central system, you know, that manage all that, where people trust to share the data about it, you may have a situation, actually, as a matter of fact, you know, in our cooperative agreement with Air Force, we're trying to prototype this cyber infrastructure where you can go from data to automatic processing of data to decision-making products that can help decision makers, you know, to understand what they need to do. You know, we're prototyping use cases. One of the use cases we're thinking about is, let's say that, you know, just to give an example from the previous panel, let's say that ULA launch a spacecraft, SpaceX launch another, you know, vehicle, another spacecraft. Now suddenly you have Dan, you know, wants to launch, you know, from the spacecraft, you know. Let's say they don't want to share data with each other in terms of understanding what one is doing to each other. So how do you handle the problem? That's one of the key questions. And we're trying really to put together a use cases, right, to show that the cyber infrastructure like us can really help resolving the problem. If I may. So it's very challenging, but at the end of the day, you have to start with the central organization that is trusted across the nation, that is international, that has specific rules of operations, and understands the challenges, which, unfortunately, as I said, in my opinion, especially for SSA, is still at level of basic research. We have to have investment even in basic research. I'll just give you an idea. You know, there is something that, you know, that is routinely used in, for example, remote sensing of Earth, right? There's a lot of spacecraft that take images looking down, and they have hyperspectral data that, you know, they can, with a lot of algorithms, they can process and figure out, for example, if it's vegetation versus soil versus water, and so on and so on. We don't have a fundamental understanding of how the spectrum of an object that you measure is linked to the nature of the objects. That's a basic thing. The only thing that exists at this point is, for example, a NASA spectral database where a bunch of excellent researchers did what they could. That is, they took a bunch of measurements of different pieces of the spacecraft and try to use that to infer properties when you measure, you know, use a spectrometer to measure an object at certain time t. But reality is that we know this is not robust. There's a lot of things that we need to do to link to things. My point is, there's a lot to do there. Yeah. And you need not only a central agency, but you need really to understand and progress, make quite a bit of progress in this direction, understanding what is the effect of the environment. Otherwise, I mean, we cannot implement efficiently policies there.
Scott, picking up on this governance question, there have been proposals in Congress before about giving FAA a role, to be kind of a central point agency in the U.S. for space traffic management. But of course, it's a global issue, right? Mm-hmm. And so we've got to have other countries cooperating in a similar fashion. There is that natural parallel with aviation in terms of how different organizations communicate with one another. But there are limits to that too, because in aviation, we still do have territory. We have sovereign airspace, and the FAA is in charge, in the U.S., and that's different our sovereign airspace. And there's clearly drawn maps of where there's international airspace, and so we come to agreements on how we're going to operate there. How do we extend that kind of model into space where there are no borders, there are no territory? We don't have our territory in space.
People talk, orbital regime-based segregation or identity-based segregation. Those, if NASA launches it, it's somebody in the U.S.'s responsibility to keep track of it, and that sort of thing. That's unresolved. We don't know yet. That's maybe an opportunity. I don't know. And then what do you do when things go through the airspace on their way to outer space? I call it air track, space track integration. They're sort of Bernoulli in the driver's seat on this one, and Kepler's in the driver's seat on that one, and the actual syntax of the messages are different. Latitude, longitude, altitude, and two-line elements. Those are different things. Now, do we create one single integrated message type, or do we rely on translators? There's all sorts of really cool engineering in your question. I want to come back to the how do we share. We did talk, I think somebody talked about NIST. So MITRE works with NIST. We operate a cyber FFRDC for them. And one of the communities that we've been working with is the wireless medical industry. So imagine you're hooked up to an insulin machine and it's controlled wirelessly. What kind of mischief could somebody do with that? And how do you protect it? So NIST convenes, and we help them, the vendors who generate those products, those wireless insulin machines. And what comes out of that then is a community around a topic. How do we make our devices resilient? What are the best practices? Now, it's not insisted by the government. It is a set of practices that seem to work. And the vendors then can decide to use them or not. And that, to me, is analogous to the commercial world in space. Some may choose to go, all the way to the extreme to make sure their OneWeb systems are very, very resilient. Others may not. But to have some calculus to make those decisions, that to me is where we need to go as a community as well.
Back to space launch here and autonomy. One of the big questions is about launch abort, flight termination. SpaceX apparently has implemented an automated system on their rocket, the Falcon 9. And that'll allow them to launch in certain trajectories now where you might not be able to have a ground controller always, with a line of sight connection, be able to terminate that. What are your thoughts on that, where that's headed, and do we need more of that, or are there risk in that? Are you comfortable with a human flight using an automated termination system?
Again, I'm thinking for my community in terms of the where we're leveraging the commercial industry. We're not anti that at all. There's a process in place whereby to demonstrate that capability. Certainly the provider is incentivized to demonstrate it well. and it seems to be working well. And there are also efforts, I think, to miniaturize those particular capabilities so it's more broadly available even for the small launch community going forward. So I think that's an area we're going to see autonomy continue to grow. And again, they'll have to work with the range, appropriate range authorities to make sure that it is demonstrated appropriately. But I think it's going in the right direction.
Yeah. Turn to another question here from the audience. It says, given existing literature on normal accident theory, and there's a good book called Normal Accidents, if you've read it, it's been around for a while, is optimizing system resilience and robustness the same thing as optimizing for maximum risk avoidance for single failure modes? It's more of a theory question here.
Think about that.
Are these the same things? Optimizing for system resilience and robustness, the same thing as optimizing for maximum risk avoidance?
Personally,
it depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
It depends. So it can be. Risk, I still prefer risk management. I'm not certain that all risks can be avoided, even through resiliency. I think risks can be mitigated, they can be watched, they can be accepted. Avoidance is very difficult. It's usually extremely expensive or unaffordable or not attainable. I think a resiliency provides you with those other mitigation paths, particularly, obviously, mitigation in that you can choose your options, be it through redundancy, be it through other options. In space launch, the previous panel was a very good panel. It was very interesting to have, Virgin with ULA and SpaceX. That in and of itself is an example of resiliency to one level, because there are multiple providers that are capable. So I'll end there.
Certainly one way to avoid risk is to do nothing.
Right. Stay on the ground.
But you accept
Just stay on the ground.
You accept another risk by doing that.
Well, that's true. Somebody else will, right?
Well, I think, again, it depends on what is the objective, of the system, or better, of the system of systems. I see resilience mostly when you deploy a system of systems, right? Because in this case, you can, guarantee uninterrupted service or high probability of performance by reconfiguring, by adapting, by avoiding the failure of one of the system as part of the system. Now, if we talk about a launch vehicle where you have astronauts, then you're talking about safety. Then guaranteeing safety, it's a more appropriate than really talking about resilience in the sense that at least I think about it. So, again, when you optimize for a system of systems, then you optimize for resilience. Maybe when you optimize a single, even complex system like a launch vehicle with a crew on top, maybe you optimize for minimizing the risk, or maximize the safety. Depends how you do it. So it depends how you see the system. I have another comment regarding also how do you ensure, the borders of the different nations. Well, more than a comment, it's just an observation that we're going to have that problem on the moon, because people start going, there. The Chinese have marching order, that is going there. We're going there. Russia are very interested, especially for helium-3, that you can mine on the surface, and forecasting in the near future, fusion maybe. So even there, how do we address the problem? And we're going to deploy eventually, if the administration march, accordingly. I foresee deploying assets in the Earth-Moon system as a springboard, opportunistically to go to other places in the solar system, both robotically and with the humans. And then you're talking about resiliency. Then NASA will have to pay much more attention on systems of systems in terms of resiliency, because then you have a lot of assets to manage, and so on and so on.
Yeah. I was just going to pile on maybe with a relatable thing. So how to get resiliency? Well, you need, and you need rules of the road, you need lawyers, and you need laws, and you need engineers, and
we've got lots of lawyers in DC.
You have to be willing to fail, right? Yeah. You have to be willing to fail, because you will, and learn from it. And so we're on a good path. We have stuff to work with now. Things are not so expensive that we can't fail.
Once you mentioned lawyer, it came to my mind autonomous lawyer. What do you think about that?
There are such things, right? Yeah. There are machines that now
machines,
do
yeah.
law interpretation and writing. But to obtain resilience, what I've learned over time, and I think I heard this earlier today from the CIOs and Mr. Lightfoot and others, is that you have to empower somebody. Somebody has to think about this as their job. And they have to think about it using, we talked about the risk management framework and the consequence likelihood, and how do we move from red to green on that. And there's tradecraft that we've learned from other domains and so on and so forth. And we need to measure it and make sure it's getting better. And it has to be repeatable. It can't be one and done. And so there are things that we can do, practices we can use, like patching on a regular basis, identifying interfaces and securing those interfaces. These are some of the engineering 101 practices. And then applying it to the different domains that we talk about as we move out and out. And we'll find that kind of the old stuff that has made us successful in the past is not going to go away. We'll use it again and again and again.
Yeah. Well, it seems like one of the things that is changing, though, is as our space exploration missions, as they get further and further away from Earth, it starts forcing us to think differently about problems and about the way we handle them. I mean, for example, just communications, getting back and forth from the Earth to our spacecraft going further out. You get out to Mars, it takes minutes traveling at the speed of light for those signals to go. So a lot of things you're going to have to design in autonomy. If not, machine autonomy, at least the crew there will have to be able to operate autonomously.
Or partnering. Chess was mentioned, like hybrid chess is where you're partnered with the machine and you're competing against another hybrid of machine and human-machine teaming. And again, what does the human do? What are humans good at? Well, they're good at recognizing things that have not been seen before, and creating a mental model of why I see what I see. Machines are good at combinatorial, alternatives and crunching numbers. So how do those work together? And we've seen enough movies about astronauts on Mars and talking to the machine and so on and so forth. But the human is still making key decisions.
Yeah, and humans are good for value judgments, right? And understanding, well, this human life is worth more than this machine over here, or in some cases it might not be that case. And you don't necessarily want to put that in the hands of an
But you're seeing all that in the other domains, the smart cars, go on the web, how much is automated for you now. So if we can think abstractly, what those other domains have learned and then apply it, I think we'll be better off than reinventing it.
Yeah. All right. We do have a few more questions here. Let's see. So one of the questions we got here is, how does resiliency play into assured access to space strategies? And so in the space community, we talk about access to space, we mean launch. I'll tell you, I also work in the policy world. When you say access to space in the policy world, and people think, oh, the ability to use space, communicate with satellites and things. But looking at it from the launch perspective, we've touched on this a bit, but NASA's strategy now with commercial cargo and crew, how big of a factor is resiliency in the way that program is structured?
I think we think about it, I think, in the manner of what we have coined as a mixed fleet approach. It's I've already alluded to it in my previous comment. having the choice, having multiple capable industry partners provides that aspect, and it's worked well for NASA for many years, and I expect us to continue with that sort of strategy, pursuing a mixed fleet approach. I mean, right now today we're blessed in terms of the launch services that we are able to contract for. We have multiple providers in the intermediate class, more than one. We have multiple providers in the medium class in terms of payload size, rocket size. And the small class is experiencing hopefully a resurgence, it appears, and that's wonderful. And so we have more choices now available to us than we have had. And so again, that's how we, at a very top level, start to view resiliency from an access to space standpoint.
All right. Any final thoughts by the panelists before we're out of time here? All right. Please join me in thanking these panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott.
Very nice.
We're going to take a quick coffee break now. When we come back, we're going to have the winner of our student competition give a quick lightning talk. So.
Yeah.
In early August, North Korea threatened to launch 4 intermediate-range ballistic missiles to a point about 30 or 40 kilometers off the coast of Guam. Tom, could you walk us through how U.S. missile defense systems would respond if such a launch was detected?
So if that happens, the United States would first detect the missile's heat signatures with satellites such as the Defense Support Program or the newer space-based infrared system. Those satellites would then cue terrestrial radars, such as the TPY-2 X-band radars in Japan and South Korea, which track the missiles with greater precision. The threat missiles would be within the radar field of view for perhaps 5 or 6 minutes. Aegis BMD ships might also be in position to track the missile's flight.
The trajectory of the missiles headed from North Korea to Guam would take them over the southern part of Japan. They'd fly just south of Hiroshima, and at that point they'd be at an altitude of about 700 kilometers. So, Tom, if the U.S. determined that these missiles were actually a threat to Guam, what systems would be called upon to respond?
If the U.S. determines the missiles to be a potential threat, we might try to shoot them down using various missile defense interceptors. This might include the sea-launched Standard Missile-3, launched from an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, or a land-based THAAD battery based in Guam, or some combination of the two. Both systems have an excellent test record, but neither has been used in an operational context against a ballistic missile fired in anger.
And all of this would happen within a relatively short period of time. So North Korea said it would take about 17 minutes time of flight to reach Guam. Others have said it could take as little as 14 minutes. Of course, it depends on the specific trajectory used. A more lofted trajectory would take longer and rise to a higher altitude in space, while a more shallow trajectory would take a bit less time and stay at a lower altitude.
So an intercept attempt with an Aegis Standard missile would be outside the atmosphere, close to its apogee during its midcourse, or during its downward descent with the THAAD system.
So all of this provides an interesting case study into how such a scenario could unfold and the way U.S. missile defense systems are designed to protect against such threats.
Right. This is the kind of threat that we've seen coming for a long time. This is why the systems are located where they are, the radars and the interceptors, but we hope we don't have to use them. To learn more about both the threat missiles from North Korea and the various missile defense systems, check out missilethreat.csis.org.
While much of the world focuses on terrorism in the Middle East, violent extremist groups have expanded their ambitions and reach in Africa as well. In the Western Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has produced or inspired a proliferation of extremist groups that continue to destabilize the region. In the areas around Lake Chad, Boko Haram, with its origins in northeast Nigeria, has left tens of thousands of civilians dead and displaced almost 3 million people. The security vacuum in Libya and the presence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda deepen the risks to the Sahel region.
There has been a lot of turmoil and trouble with these radical elements, which you find in this arc of instability from North Africa to Afghanistan.
Military intervention by regional forces, France, and the UN have weakened these groups and reclaimed territories they once held. But the drivers of militancy and the complex social, economic, and political environment that fuels these groups remain very much intact. Unless this understructure of vulnerability and criminality is addressed, extremist violence will remain an enduring threat to the region.
I'm Christy Turlington Burns, founder and CEO of Every Mother Counts, and I'm a member of the CSIS Task Force on Women's and Family Health. I joined this effort because I believe our country has a role to play in saving the lives of vulnerable women and children around the world. For the last 18 months, we have worked hard to build a vision for the United States to lead. We believe the moment is ripe for a new initiative to unlock the potential of adolescent girls. Too often, girls and young women in the developing world fall through the cracks, facing early marriage, unintended pregnancy, gender-based violence, and exploitation. But we know that when girls are healthy and educated, they become leaders. They contribute to their economies, have healthy families, and build stronger communities and countries. In turn, Americans benefit from a safer, more prosperous world. We believe that we have a cost-effective and forward-looking proposal that Americans of all stripes can support. Our plan builds on a record of long-standing global leadership by the United States. We would focus on 13 low-income countries with great need and existing investments in areas important to the health and well-being of women and girls. We would spearhead new goals in 4 areas: maternal and newborn health, family planning, nutrition, and vaccination against HPV to prevent cervical cancer. These are key services that are commonplace in the United States, ones that benefit women and girls in a major way. We have also focused on how to get things done, guided by the principles of efficiency, accountability, and partnership. We call for the leadership by the Secretary of State, USAID, and country missions, as well as high-level diplomacy to ensure that the U.S. does not go it alone. We demonstrate the need for better data, new innovations, integration of services, and an expanded role for the private sector. And we note the importance of sustained financial backing from the U.S. and our key partners. We've put forth a bold agenda because it will take big ideas and new approaches to help millions of girls and women living in poverty to realize their true potential. It holds the promise of changing the world for the better, a signature achievement for the Trump administration and the United States. I hope that as a country, we can unite to make this vision a reality.
Space is a critical enabler for military operations and an increasingly important domain of modern warfare. But operating in space is expensive. What would it mean for the U.S. military if costs were reduced significantly?
Start 1, 0.
Disruptive breakthroughs that could significantly reduce the cost of access to space may come in many forms. One of the most pursued methods for reducing the cost of access to space is making launch vehicles less expensive. Building launch vehicles in much greater quantities can enable efficiencies in the manufacturing process, but quantity alone is unlikely to yield order of magnitude reductions in costs. Novel forms of propulsion could also one day reduce costs.
But perhaps the most promising disruption is reusability. If a launch vehicle can be reused 10 times with minimal maintenance between flights, it could, in theory, reduce the effective vehicle cost by roughly an order of magnitude. Repairing or reusing satellites in space through on-orbit servicing could also reduce the cost of access to space. Instead of launching a 5,000-kilogram satellite to field a new space capability, one could launch a 500-kilogram payload to upgrade an existing satellite.
A significant reduction in the cost of access to space could enable new military space missions that are not feasible at current costs. Placing conventional weapons in orbit to strike targets on Earth has been explored in the past. One limitation has been the cost of launching the large number of satellites that would be needed to have a similar capability as a fleet of ground-based long-range missiles. An even larger constellation of satellites would be needed for a boost-phase kinetic missile interceptor system. Because the kill vehicle required for a missile intercept is more technologically complex, launch costs are a smaller share of the total cost. A space-based missile interceptor system could also be adapted to strike an adversary's satellites or to defend against anti-satellite missiles launched at friendly satellites.
Lower launch costs could also enable space transportation and logistics for critical military operations. A crewed vehicle system similar to what commercial firms are developing for space tourism could be adapted by the military to deliver small numbers of special operations forces or critical supplies to virtually any location on Earth within 30 to 45 minutes. Many of the disruptions that could reduce the cost of access to space and enable new missions, architectures, and operations for the U.S. military could also provide the same advantages to potential adversaries. Other nations could be incentivized to field space-based systems for ground attack, missile defense, and anti-satellite missions, whether or not the United States pursues such systems. A significant reduction in the cost of launch vehicles in particular could mean a reduction in the cost of long-range missiles, potentially leading to a rapid and uncontrolled proliferation.
Significant cost reductions are not likely until space launch becomes more of a commercial rather than a government activity. But the government has a big role to play. The government can seed key market areas by paying for and sharing risky early R&D on disruptive technologies, and helping commercial companies develop common standards so that a competitive commercial ecosystem emerges. The government can help commercial space grow by purchasing more services rather than using only its own version of these capabilities. Government can be the anchor customer for many of the emerging disruptive commercial technologies on the horizon. Also, the government can make getting to space easier by simplifying government approvals and striking a careful balance to maintain the United States' lead in commercial space while protecting national security.
The emergence of a robust commercial space market and the promise and peril it offers will take time to fully develop, but the nation that shapes this future is likely to benefit the most.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Food and the way we eat has always been changing. From how it's grown, sourced, prepared, to the consequences on health and the ethics of what we eat. In the 20th century alone, we saw food in many different ways, and today there are many new trends shaping what and how we eat.
6 billion, 7.
5 planets. The age of electronics.
Big data isn't self-regenerating growth.
Subject to arrest. The 113th Congress.
Food of the future will involve 3 major drivers: availability, access, and stability. Are current food production and efficiency gains sustainable? With more people, there needs to be more food. Growth of this order requires more arable land and better farming. Most importantly, it requires significantly more water. The effects of global climate change will further exacerbate today's water problems. With the presence of extreme weather, dry regions will be drier and wet regions will be wetter. Access to food is tied to wealth and location. We produce plenty of food on the planet, but not necessarily where we need it. While global hunger and poverty have declined, factors of access and utility still include food income, malnutrition, and obesity. With more people, there is more demand for finite resources: food, water, and clean air. Food shortages, riots, and mass migration will lead to global instability. But there are opportunities for change to avoid this precipice. The world is witnessing incredible advances in food production technology. While these are in many ways considered cutting-edge ideas, not all solutions require radical forward thinking. If the developing world would adopt farming practices that were in place 50 years ago in the developed world, yields would certainly improve.
Also, there is a need for continued agricultural research with an emphasis on commercialization.
In addition, sources of food such as jellyfish and insects are regular staples in societies that are considered to be underdeveloped, but will continue to find their way into the diets of the developed world. Distributing the food revolutions of today is a major factor in creating a more secure future.
The key to ensuring food security lies in the lessons of the past, the people of the present, and the ideas of the future.
I believe in strong alliances, clarity in dealing with our rivals.
What is the very last
and I take the oil.
Populism, border walls, retrenchment, and protectionism. While foreign policy is often overshadowed by economic concerns, contrasting visions of America's role in the world have played a major part in the recent election cycle. This contentious campaign season saw some of the basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II called into question. Does this heightened acrimony over key aspects of U.S. international engagement reflect trends toward isolationism? It may seem unprecedented, but it is in fact not new. Today's controversies are continuations of debates that have lasted for decades. While support for the nation playing an active part in global affairs has remained strong since 1947, public opinion on key components of U.S. international engagement, such as defense spending, has waxed and waned over the last 70 years in response to economic trends, military interventions, and domestic priorities. In the first decades of the Cold War, America was committed to international engagement as a part of its strategy of containment against the existential threat presented by the Soviet Union. The U.S. experience in Vietnam, however, created an aversion to overseas military engagements that lasted from the late 1960s through the 70s. During the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union led the U.S. public and policymakers to again question defense spending levels, foreign aid, and forward military presence. Many thought the limited interventions of Desert Storm in Kosovo would serve as models for future military operations. Then came September 11, 2001. Our response to the events of that day have largely defined contemporary American foreign policy since. First came the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their unsatisfactory outcomes left much of the public and policymaking elites disillusioned with large-scale military engagements. The result of that disillusionment has been an increasing reliance on small footprint forces for a variety of contingency operations, including in the global war on terror. At home, the most severe recession since the Great Depression exacerbated America's growing reservations about global engagement. As the economy recovered at an anemic pace, income inequality ballooned. Fewer were able to reap the benefits of our globalized economy. Opposition to free trade and large-scale immigration grew. Now, 8 years after the recession and the more than 15 after 9/11, views on the desirability of America's international engagement strategy are fractured. For the first time ever in 2009 and again in 2013, most Americans responded that the U.S. should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. This comes at the same time that more people are concerned about major domestic terror attacks than in 2002, just months after 9/11. Do these polls reflect temporary reactions to the state of public affairs? Or is there a genuine trend toward retrenchment in the American public? Democrats and Republicans now disagree on the benefits of free trade, alliances, and multilateral approaches. Divergences in threat perceptions and approaches to international engagement have also grown between the American public and policymakers. As history shows, this is not a new debate in American politics. Yet, as distance from World War II and the Cold War grows, the rationale for U.S. foreign policy of engagement may be growing less clear to younger generations. If the new administration decides that sustaining a strategy premised on deep international engagement is best suited for the advancement of American interests, it will have to do a better job of communicating the rationale for those policies to create a foreign policy the American public can get behind. If, on the other hand, the new administration seeks to chart a new course for American foreign policy, it will have to find avenues of consensus among an increasingly fractured public.
Air power and military space systems have revolutionized the way the U.S. military operates, and the global economy increasingly depends on reliable and secure access to space systems. The Aerospace Security Project at CSIS examines the technological, budgetary, and policy issues affecting the air and space domains. Our research is focused in 3 areas. Space security examines the evolving military uses of space and how the lack of norms of behavior can affect escalation and deterrence. It explores how alternative architectures and new space capabilities can enhance the resilience of U.S. military space systems. Air dominance and long-range strike looks at the future of air and missile forces in a more contested operating environment.
The obligation to bring academia and industry to bear on behalf of our sponsors. So we work very closely with a consortium of universities, and I'm delighted to follow NASA's lead in issuing challenges for these students to participate in some of our policy development discussions. So for this conference, we hosted over the Christmas break, by the way, with submissions due on New Year's Eve, a challenge question, which was simply to, without any charts, to describe a threat scenario in a satellite servicing environment. And we had more than a dozen entries from the top schools in the country. We had one female engineer make a submission of that dozen. And our winner is here to present for you his video submission to us. His name is Peyton Strickland. He's from the University of Alabama, and I hope you'll give him your attention and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Naramore, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Peyton Strickland, and I'm an aerospace engineering student at the University of Alabama. The challenge question I responded to was imagine a threat scenario to satellite servicing. The $400 million U.S. Air Force missile warning satellite DSP-23 immediately came to mind. It is drifting eastward through the geobelt at a rate of about 1 degree longitude per week. Satellite servicing has the potential to extend the life of this critical and costly asset. The purpose for satellite servicing is clear: to refuel, repair, or upgrade satellites after they are launched. With multi-million-dollar costs to build and place a new satellite in orbit, the potential economic benefits of on-orbit servicing are appreciable. As a result, several private companies are now planning to provide this service in the near future. As we look forward to the potential benefits of this technology, we are in position now to make sure we understand and work to mitigate any new risk this technology could bring. In my DSP-23 scenario, An adversary would also know that a crash between this satellite and a satellite servicer could result in the loss of an estimated $1 billion in hardware and leave the United States without one of its early warning satellites that played a crucial role during Desert Storm in detecting Iraqi Scud missiles and will continue to play an important role in future detection of missile launches. The heart of the risk assessment process focuses on three components: consequences, vulnerabilities, and threats. Threat scenarios seek to identify significant vulnerabilities that, if exploited, could inflict maximum damage. And today, I present you with two possible scenarios related to satellite servicing. In 2012, the Humphreys Group drone hack at White Sands made national news after the group was able to successfully spoof a drone into believing it was climbing, causing it to automatically adjust and nearly crash into the sand. With implementation of on-orbit satellite servicing, one is tasked with putting the satellite servicer directly on the path of an already orbiting satellite. If a hacker was able to spoof the location of either the satellite or satellite servicer, the hacker could cause the two satellites to crash into one another. With the forthcoming expansion of LEO satellites with several proposed mega constellations, this threat scenario is particularly dangerous with LEO satellites due to the potential domino effect known as the Kessler syndrome. Two prospective methods of spoofing to carry out such an attack include meakening and nulling. Meakening records the true GNSS signals and replaces the signals through a transmitter with enough gain to overwhelm the true signal. A meakener has the ability to spoof any GNSS signal, even an encrypted military signal. The victim receiver's false position fits will be that of the spoofer's reception antenna. Thus, it will deduce a false time that will be earlier than the true time. As a result, it might deduce a time of 159.59.9 when the time is actually too flat. Gradually, this time difference continues to grow, and the satellite servicer can have traveled further and even into the other satellite before ground control is aware of what has happened. Nulling, on the other hand, is a more advanced spoofing method. The spoofer transmits two signals for each spoofed signal. One is the spoofed version that acts in concert with all other spoofed signals in order to induce a false position/timing fits. The other is the negative of the true version signal, resulting in destructive interference. Thus, nulling erases all traces of the true signal from the total received signal and is impossible to recover GNSS navigation. According to a DHS report, a pinpoint spoofing attack, such as the one I've described, could take up to 30 days or more to locate the malicious device. Finally, if a hacker is able to overtake control of a satellite servicer by breaching the tracking, telemetry, and control links while the satellite servicer is doing repairs or refueling on a commercial or defense satellite, the hacker could potentially disable the satellite or divert the information or control of the satellite to another location. In commercial TT&C environments, TT&C ground stations are more freely accessible. The attacker could exploit a flaw in the command and control of commercial satellites, such as VSAT hubs, to compromise military satellite systems through collision and debris fields. The effects of these two possible scenarios are not to be understated. The potential threats I have outlined do not mean we should slow the development of satellite servicing technology and never realize its potential benefits. However, with commercial satellite servicing on the horizon, policymakers and engineers have the opportunity now to examine these potential vulnerabilities and mitigate them. Whether through discussions around cryptographic civil GPS authentication, increased protection of commercial TT&C ground stations, or other solutions, we can take steps to ensure the full positive potential of this technology. I am a future engineer, a problem solver, and I look forward to being part of the solutions that satellite servicing will require. Stars can't shine without darkness, and solutions cannot be generated without informed policy makers. Together, policy makers and engineers can bring these solutions to bear. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all. Why don't we get started here with the final panel of the day. So thanks for hanging in there for the audience here. But we're gonna keep this lively and mildly to highly controversial, depending on where my panelists here want to go. But just briefly introduce them, and then we'll get into the questions here. Far on there is Rich Leshner from Planet. He is Vice President here of DC Operations and Regulatory Affairs and Policy. Al Tadros, Vice President of Space Infrastructure and Civil Operations for Space Systems Loral. Jeffrey Mamber, the CEO of NanoRacks. And Jen Gustetic, the head of NASA's Small Business SBIR and STTR program. So we just heard an incredible speech by Peyton, and I just want to turn to Al here, who's doing satellite servicing on the cusp of it. Should we be nervous, Al? What do we need to worry about?
First of all, great job, Peyton, and we were commenting to each other. It's hope for the future of aerospace when we hear young students like you and excited about not only engineering but space, and thinking deeply about the problems and excited about the problems that we have to look at addressing. So great topic, absolutely necessary. It's probably been a topic of a lot of space missions, and maybe the impetus for the reason to go to the moon with Apollo missions is, who has control of space and who's actually superior in space. It'll be an ongoing topic. For satellite servicing, the capabilities, specifically rendezvous and proximity operations that are going to be integrated into satellites, the robotic arms, the capabilities to image things, inspect things, and manipulate things, all are right at the horizon here. We are implementing them. NASA Restore-L is deploying a LEO refueling mission. Will refuel a satellite that wasn't designed to be refueled, has all that capability, and will only advance the capability more and faster. DARPA is developing, along with SSL, the capability in geostationary orbit to not only do all of that, but also repair and add payloads to spacecraft in geostationary orbit. Quite a extremely capable spacecraft, and the vision for the architectures that it'll enable is astounding. Yes, we worry about those capabilities. We worry about security. We worry about cross-correlation of sensor data. We worry about ground security, not just space. A lot of people talk about attacks in space, but the attacks probably in cyber are lower cost, more accessible to many of the adversaries. So it's both our spacecraft in orbit, but the ground capabilities that we look at, worry about, and address. Let me just add another dimension to that. We resupply our ships at sea underway. We refuel our aircraft in the air, in battle zones. This is not going to be the first time that we have a resupply capability, a reconstitution capability in the midst of a warfighting environment. We will have to address those concerns, but the intent is to proceed and proceed smartly while we do that.
Yeah, thanks. Al, that raises an interesting point on how the U.S. government is able to extend its protections here on Earth, right? And something it sort of reflects on something that we've talked about in a different setting, but there is discussion. If we look at the recently released national security policy, it has a line in there talking about the importance of commercial space to the national security enterprise, and raising the possibility that the U.S. government itself needs to extend its umbrella of protection in some circumstances, possibly to commercial space. So sort of pulling on that analogy a bit, wanted to throw that to the panel here on that concept. Is that something that either you're thinking about, you're sensing the U.S. government coming to you with that in mind, or if not, is it something that you could see could impact your business model, positively or negatively?
Well, we had been talking about this a little backstage, and we all realized that where we weren't experts in things like international law associated with the transport of vessels in the open oceans, right? What's the what protections exist for, or what protections are provided by the U.S. government if a U.S. flagged vessel is attacked by a foreign power. And we all were a little bit stumped. We ought to know the answers, and we didn't. But
speak for yourself.
But it seems like there's something percolating because there are similar-ish language in the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act. If I got all of the names, if I got that correct, I don't have that language memorized off the top of my head, but there's a similar, either a paragraph or a couple sentences speaking to the need for that umbrella to be included. And it's with respect to, if it's something that's very targeted and specific toward how communication satellites are seemingly such an integrated part of how the DoD does operations, that could be a compartmentalized thing and could have a very specific set of meanings. If it's something broader than that and is intended to sort of extend the reach of the government to protect systems as they move beyond LEO and initially explore asteroids or do private sector operations on the moon, it could have a broader and more complicated meaning. And so I think that it's probably worth getting a panel of folks from the congressional side of the policymaking world and the executive branch side and saying, what are you guys talking about? What do you want to achieve here?
Several years ago, I was at an international conference, and there were about 4 commercial space folks and about 10 NASA and US government. And when I got there, I was surprised that nobody from NASA and the government wanted to talk to me beforehand, sort of on our strategy. And I do a lot of work overseas. I have my whole career. And in Italy, and in France, and Germany, even in the UK, and of course in China and Russia, the business sector and the government are hand in hand. Okay, especially when they go overseas. They know, they've figured it out. They figured out their strategy beforehand. So what you're seeing here from us is such an American reaction because it's not coordinated in our society between the government and the private sector, these sort of issues. And I think we're fairly alone in that. It's just a sort of, it's maybe a comment off to the side, but the more that space becomes, which it is today, a critical component, we have got to have more coordination between the emerging commercial sector and what we're doing and the government. And because I can assure you the other governments, when they look at us and we arrive somewhere overseas, they think we've had that coordination. And a lot of times we haven't in our society.
Interesting. So since you raised, Jeffrey, since you've raised international here, I need to, we're talking about resilience, something that folks may not know about, maybe you can tell a little background before you get to this is, NanoRack successfully launched a Chinese university payload from the International Space Station, right? And so as we think about, resilience and some of the questions earlier in the day, when we're thinking about threats and different state actors, can you tell us a little bit about that experience? Maybe a little background on it, but also I can imagine there were some hoops to go through to get a Chinese university payload successfully launched from the International Space Station beyond just the technical.
As Mike well knows, and many of you in the room probably know, there's a Wolf Amendment, which prohibits NASA, and I think the State Department, and I think a few other parts of the U.S. government from working with the Chinese space program. I understand some of the values and reasons. I understand the reasons for the Wolf Amendment. Some of them I well understand. No one wants technology transfer to go, and we have other concerns. But I really felt in the competitive world we find ourselves that a blanket boycott by the United States against an emerging space power is in the civil arena is uncalled for. And great nations have a multiplicity of ways that they can trade and communicate with other nations. And as I look at China, of course we do not have, unfortunately, good relations in the military. And Congress has decreed that we can't have relations in the civil with NASA. And so that really leaves the commercial. And so, I was at a conference in Wuhan, China about 2.5 months ago. There were 300 people there, and I was the only American. I went back and told Gerstenmaier that I finally had my dream come true. I led an American delegation. Okay, I mean, one American was in the room, and that's just not how you maintain your status as a leader and a great space power. So quickly, at NanoRacks, we studied the Wolf Amendment. We saw that its provisions boiled down to technology transfer. They don't want embrace of the People's Liberation Army by the American government. And we crafted a commercial program with researchers at Beijing Institute of Technology to do synthetic DNA study. It was a reflight for them, so they weren't learning anything. They were paying us, so there was no transfer of payment. They were not associated with the People's Liberation Army. They publish all their results in English. And so when we spoke to first the administration, and then when we spoke to some in Congress opposed, who support the Wolf Amendment, they saw that we had crafted out a means to do work with the Chinese in a way that enhance our values, show our leadership, engage the Chinese who believe in transparency. And so we were allowed to do that, and we're continuing. We're expanding the program now to more universities in China that uphold those considerations. It's a necessary step, and I hope in a few years that NASA will be allowed in some way to interface appropriately. Look, we're going back to the moon, this time to stay. Newsflash, China's on the moon. How are we going to handle that fact? Are we going to continue an embargo against NASA being allowed to engage with a program that's already on the moon? Final comment. At that Wuhan conference, there were delegations of Italians, delegations of Russians. The German and Airbus have a multiplicity of programs planned on the Chinese space station. United Nations has a microgravity program planned, and we are not allowed to have our space agency. So I hope we can correct that, and I'm not being flippant here, to do so not in the Washington way of when this side gains 4 seats, we overturn this amendment, but we really sit down. I understand the Wolf Amendment, I understand the concerns, and in a meaningful way allow NASA to work with with what's going to be one of the strongest programs on the Earth.
Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. I think thinking about policies, and this morning we had a couple different discussions about setting, do we need to look at create new standards or create new policies around some of the cyber vulnerabilities that we're seeing writ large, but especially in space. I wanted to, given all you here, representing leading edge tech companies here, and starting with you, Jen, with the community you service and you work with, how do they think about it? Is that a scary thing? What do we need to think about before we go too far down that path?
Yeah, and to give you all a sense, the SBIR program is NASA's small business innovation research program that invests around $200 million a year in awards to small businesses for early stage innovative research, for concept studies and then prototypes. That is not a trivial amount of money. And it's also just for small businesses. So when you talk about investing in the development of disruptive technologies, risk reduction on technologies that we know that we're going to need both as a NASA customer and also potentially other commercial customers would need, we play a significant role in early stage technology development. So I say that to tell you that we work with thousands of companies. Last year we funded 300, 400 different companies, 500 awards, like I said, $200 million. That's a lot of people that we work with. And a lot of those companies, 60% of them have less than 25 employees. So they're small, very small. So when you think about increasing the kind of paperwork on those companies, it has significant effect on small shops, the folks that are doing a lot of this early stage kind of innovative research. And so we have to think very carefully, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's reporting requirements, whatever the requirements are, about what are reasonable levels of burden to put on these folks that they're not making a profit off their phase 1. I mean, I know you guys NanoRacks got a phase 1 back in 2010. It was
very, very important to us. It was very, very, and you turned us down like 6, but I won't go there. Okay,
they got one.
No, we got one. It was very important, yeah.
But $125K for 6 months doesn't pay the total full costs of what it takes to do that.
But we got outside capital based on that, and so it was very good.
And so, but companies are investing significant time and resources in order to get these awards that have great value beyond just the cash value, but it's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, and If you hold them to the same standard as you do a large company that might have a huge shop that can do things like IT security planning and put together a super comprehensive IT security plan from soup to nuts that's thought about every scenario, and it's a different kind of level of expectation that you can have for these small firms versus the large firms on what's reasonable for them to do before they can even compete. So if we are unreasonable about the degrees of requirements that we put on these folks, you might end up cutting innovation off at its legs and not even letting those folks into the pipeline to develop the things that they could have developed otherwise. And so, you know, we believe security planning is, I mean, it's very important. You can't say that it's not important, right? We require our companies to submit a plan, a security plan, after they've been selected. But it's a question of role of government here, I think, and the degree to which we scrutinize those plans and the degree to which we get in your business when you tell us what you're doing with your IT security plans. Or is it our responsibility to educate you about the threats, to provide some training, to provide some guidance, and then if there is something that happens, then have the right and the means to get involved in the appropriate way, depending on what the actual incident was. Not necessarily having approval control over your 500-page requirement security plans that become a required template from the US government. So there has just been some movement to standardize IT security planning and cybersecurity requirements on the NIST side. And an open question is to what extent you hold compliance with those standards as some sort of entry criteria for small businesses before they can even enter the program to participate. And we need to think very carefully about those things before putting the same obligations on small as we do on big.
Yeah. So I want to pass that same question if some of the other companies here are facing any of those tensions, but also if you are or not, do we have the right forums? Do we have the right governance structures or places to have those discussions to make sure we're balancing that properly or not? Or are we in a situation where you are afraid something gets thrown over the fence that has an outsized impact that wasn't properly deliberated?
Let me make a couple comments on that. I think, so I'm not an expert in it, but I do see some of the ramifications of security concerns for commercial space. And some of it is, well, we can't use a commercial capability or we can't use a commercial platform, whether it's hosted payloads or other things, because cybersecurity is a concern. So it may be to the detriment of commercial industry if it's not well understood or regulated or defined to some extent. The level of security that the government might then carve it out as saying, well, it's not approved to be used by the government, and it might create a bigger wall. I completely agree, overburdening, and we work with a lot of SBIRs as they try to transition the technologies into large company product or license it out. And I think that's great. It's a great resource, and I know NASA does a great job of helping the small companies transition technologies. But I do also see the government shying away from commercial capabilities that might not have their stamp of approval on related to security.
Yeah, commercial remote sensing is a decently regulated industry, and one of the aspects that is part of the licensing process is reviewing plans for data protection. But we also have regularly scheduled on-site inspections at mission control facilities and at ground stations. And so these regular touch points really do create several opportunities for dialogue, discussion, as the government begins to think about how it might shift its priorities in what it cares about with respect to security. So some time ago, they might have had a nearly exclusive focus on physical security, and now that's obviously, nobody would discount physical security, but cybersecurity, protections against intrusions and so forth are growing. Those touch points that happen frequently throughout a year create opportunities for insight, dialogue, right? So it's one of the flip sides of the regulatory oversight mechanism that, once you learn how to interact with your regulator and have a dialogue and they become comfortable sharing concerns in a way that isn't just specific to the formulaic process of submitting forms and paperwork on a quarterly basis, you do have the opportunity to see where they're going to be, project that forward in your own planning, realize where you might actually think that you've got some thoughts and perspectives and approaches that could be beneficial if you fed that back. So it's sort of like the flip side of everybody in industry is going to tell you they want as little regulation as possible, but that doesn't mean no regulation, and it necessarily doesn't mean that a healthy relationship with a regulator isn't beneficial to all parties.
And knowing that you find that all your regulators are great partners, is there one good example? Is there an example or process where you think we should hold it up and we should look at it as one that is giving you the flexibility, but obviously answering the government's concerns in a balanced way?
I mean, I don't want to name people, but I think that, and there are problems with the frequency and extensiveness of them, but I do think that the on-site inspections and the dialogue that they create do have, from NOAA, they do have benefit in that regard. There are downsides to them too, and I don't think this is a panel about the comparative costs and benefits of those efforts, but that aspect of it, the dialogue through those forced face-to-face meetings actually is pretty good.
If I could just add one thing. We have been pleasantly surprised. The last 5 years, we've been thinking about a future with commercial space platforms, and this gets into resiliency as well. And we see a multiplicity of commercial platforms throughout LEO and GEO and deep space. And it's been remarkable to watch the regulatory agencies in LEO, concerning, and I don't want to name names, where at first the only vehicle, literally and figuratively, you could launch a satellite from was a launch vehicle. And so they did not factor in at all the space station. And there were times when we were moving people around, like Planet, and I remember once Planet calling me and saying, "What have you done? You've moved us from one vehicle to another." I thought it was a good thing. But it turns out that it may not be, because the regulatory authority had determined that the deployment, I don't know the correct legal term, is deployment vehicle was the launch vehicle when in fact it was the station. And so we've had remarkable progress from our vantage point in folks understanding that at times now the launch vehicle is not the deployment of the vehicle for the deployment of satellites. Indeed, the space station is, and how you get to the space station is not germane to the regulatory process. So as we look to the future in resiliency, we want to see more of that, recognizing that it may be within space manufacture, it may be with other things that the regulatory authorities have to adapt to what we're doing. So.
Yeah, and I think the question that you ask about forums is really, really critical, because the forums could also be built for folks where not everyone that would have an interest would have a voice. So thinking about how you create inclusive forums, right, that are fair too in these discussions are really important. And one thing specifically in the SBIR program that we've tried to do in the last couple of years is really open up the means for companies to tell us what they think. What is hard? What are the barriers? In the past, they could go and talk to like a particular technical person that they maybe knew, or call up Carlos Torres, program manager, and talk to them about the particular issues that they were grappling with. But this is a perfect example of where you don't have collective bargaining. You have 500 units of individual companies. Each has their own issue, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. Nor are they organized very well necessarily to advocate for the issues that they think that they collectively have as a small business community. And so simple things that we did were things like start an annual meeting, an annual industry day, start an annual RFI. Now those things, industry day and RFI, it pains me to say those because those are such stodgy old engagement mechanisms, but step by step. And those are also what people understand. People understand an industry day, they understand an RFI, and then there can be other means to try to create more meaningful dialogues that get around particular issues as you move forward in the future. But the first step is even opening the door and inviting people, truly inviting people in to have a conversation and learn about and listen to what you don't know and possibly seed. So what we've done at our last industry days is started to do trainings on cybersecurity. Seed that thought in their mind if they weren't already thinking about it, right? So you can actually start to have more productive dialogues, and we can understand this community in a way where it's not just the one-offs that are reaching us, either through a congressional inquiry or through, direct kind of call to, my office, but really understanding the issues in the industry kind of more comprehensively.
Interesting. Something that came up a couple times today was several panelists or speakers commented on the transition that we're seeing as part of the small sat revolution is an increased commoditization of space hardware, and whether that in itself is changing the resilience question. And I can see this, going either way. And so, Rich, one of Planet's successes is what you all call agile aerospace and the ability to take advantage of that commoditization. So I want to turn it to you and how you all think about that, the positive or negative impacts from a resilience perspective.
Well, so the company got started, right, with the vision for its Earth observation mission, right, and then wanted to prove that such a thing was possible in a new kind of way, which led to the approach that I think lots of people have heard Planet talk about before, which is agile aerospace, right? So a key, not the key, there's multiple elements here, but a key part of the approach is to look for those things that are available in large quantities that are bought at marginal prices, and where the technology is continuing to improve rapidly. So whether it's Moore's Law or whatever else you want to call it. So memory chips and batteries and all sorts of things that are inside iPhones and elsewhere, right? And the overwhelming benefit of that is that you get an opportunity to improve performance, increase reliability, and generally get more per dollar out of your satellite in significantly shorter time frames than had historically been the case. It does move a portion, one could argue that it does move a portion of the aerospace industry or the space industry away from supplier bases that are more specialized and doing specialized hardware and protection against solar events and so forth. But part of the counter to that, if you're maybe from an economics point of view, is the industry that depends on or utilizes commoditized capabilities or commoditized parts wouldn't exist anyway to take advantage of the standard supply chain. So the fact that there's a negative hit to that supply chain is sort of a non-reality. From a government's point of view, I think it does speak to how choices have to be made for where commercial services are leveraged and where you make intelligent decisions for specialized, unique satellites that do benefit from the specialization of chips and protection of chips and space hardening and radiation hardening and all that other stuff. But I think that there's way more in the side of benefit and opportunity, particularly over the long term, because of the improvements that come, than there is sort of downside or negative, particularly if you think about the industrial base.
Let me add to that. I think there's an enormous amount of investment right now going into unmanned vehicles, and the sensors and the algorithms and the capabilities that are being developed in that domain are going to dwarf what we spend in robotics in space or autonomous vehicles in space, and is going to get to the point where rendezvous proximity operations might leverage things that autonomous driving vehicles use rather than, specialty shops doing, LiDAR with, a few units or less a year being sold. So I think there's a lot of advantage for, leveraging those kind of capabilities, and it's an enabler. I agree completely with Rich on that. It isn't one or the other. I think for some missions, it's going to be an enabler. It's the price point and the production rate that will make it possible to do certain missions.
And one thing we spend a lot of time thinking about in SBIR is when we're selecting our companies for, say, a phase 2, and we're looking at the commercial potential, because by law, we have to consider commercial potential of the technology when we're assessing it. We look at, as part of that evaluation, how likely is this company to exist in 10 years when we need to buy the one item that we need to buy? So we'll say sometimes, with an SBIR, with some of our subtopics, not all of them, but the market at the end is 5. You're going to buy one to bake, one to break, one to shake, one to fly, and one to put on the shelf. So if you're buying 5 of them, that a market does not make. So if it's a specialty piece that you need that's really mission critical, it's enabling Nobel science, or it's enabling you to do a thing that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, that is a huge obvious benefit of tapping into that research community through SBIR, but there's a reality about how do you ensure those people are around when you need it. And so this whole question of creating enabling technologies that can also support markets beyond just the 5 that we need is critical from a resiliency standpoint for us, because when we need it, we need it. It might be 10 years from now. If you have mission slips, if you have, you need it when you need it, and you need the company to be around and the people to be around to still give it to you.
Yeah, that's good.
I think 2 great examples of those technologies right now that NASA needs, but may not buy a lot of, is optical communications in space and solar electric propulsion. That's used extensively, solar electric propulsion is used extensively by commercial space, by our company and others doing geocomsats and other satellites. And NASA occasionally uses it for exploration. So we're partnered with JPL on an exploration mission that leverages the commercial capabilities. They would not be able to afford a one-off every 10 years to do a mission like that. So those are great examples of where commercial space helps resilience in government missions by sustaining a supply chain, improving, continually developing, evolving, addressing obsolescence, and then having it as available. I think optical comm will be that way in 5 to 10 years. Commercial space will be deploying a lot of capabilities that the government, has traditionally looked at developing one every 10 years or so to deploy.
And so thinking of that potential future and future technology, an interesting question, for some of the audience here, we've done a lot of talking about smaller systems, and the question is, what role do we see in the future for larger systems? What is the continued role for larger systems, and how does that fit into the resilience discussion?
And what is a larger system?
Larger than a nano rack. You can't launch it from your
It's your question.
I'll start, but look, I mean, for some missions, physics is just the driver. So for some missions, I know disaggregation and formation flying and distributed systems. Okay, yes, right. But economics comes into it. It isn't just, yes, we could do it differently, but there's economics into it. So geocomsats, which SSL builds a lot of for global customer set, have maintained relevance in the telecommunications industry through innovation. We don't build the same satellites we even built 3 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And by innovating new spectrum, higher power, spot beams, high throughput satellites, et cetera, there's relevance and innovation. Large systems allow economy of scale. So more bandwidth per satellite, you could drop the dollars per bit served, and you get better customer price points if you can meet the quality of service that terrestrial systems provide. That's the economics of geocomsats. So if you can get more bits from a satellite and drop the dollars per bit, it's great. So there's size benefit to that. Yes, you can scale some of that for constellations, and there's that mix of benefit, but you have to then deal with large constellation deployment and maintenance and replenishment and so forth. So there's a purpose for large platforms. That's for communications. We're just at a conference for space telescopes, NASA's astrophysics community. They're looking at the next generation telescopes after James Webb and after Hubble and so forth. What is it that we need to do? And to get the science, there is no substitute for the apertures that they need. And okay, so those are examples of scale. So and we do build some of the world's largest commercial satellites, but also build some of the world's smallest commercial satellites. So we're fortunate to be, supplying Planet with satellites. Of course, our new brethren in Digital Globe are using small satellites in LEO. There's a purpose and a place for each, and I think satellite servicing will actually enable architectures where it might not be large or small. It might be reconfigurable, expandable. It might be something totally different than one or the other. So I'll leave that out there.
I mean, I would only echo it by saying right, so you do the evaluation of what you really want or what you really need. So if it's astrophysics data, if it's climate observations, if it's some sort of national security need, you go through the math associated with the physics of it, right? So some of that just becomes inescapable. You do some sort of assessment of dollars per X, and X is the variable you might want to maximize for cost, and other things you maximize for resiliency or security or protection. But somewhere along the line also should be if you're in the government world anyway, should be the challenging question, or the question to challenge the assumption of, do we even need to do this ourselves, or is this available as a service somewhere? And the thinking goes that in the world of commercial space where things are available increasingly as a service, much of that math has already been done, and the combination of variables has been done, so that whether you're a big platform or a small platform, what you're doing is providing the thing at the end at a price point that is most useful to some actor in the market. And so when you ask about what's the role for large platforms, they don't go anywhere. They do the thing that they do, and they get targeted toward the markets and the maximization of different variables that are appropriate to answering that market and the inherently governmental versus services available question.
I've got a lot of questions from the audience here that want to ask you about your regulatory barriers and regulatory things that could change. I'll modify it a bit, right? I'll put it to say, if the government was interested in what we're talking about today, creating a more resilient civil space architecture, what could or should the government do that would get you all to respond, and in your case, sort of your small business community to respond positively?
I'll start and say the major right now, as we look at post-International Space Station environment, there are those in the government and those at NASA who are still trying to figure out how we can show one winner, okay, that one company will step up. And we need to have a completely different mindset that, let it be the market. There should be automated, perhaps uncrewed platforms in space manufacture, platforms for political purposes with astronauts and for a gateway to deep space, and you can have hotels and you can have satellite deployment. So my point is that we need a regulatory environment and frequency, expand the intergovernmental agency agreement called the IGA that runs the space station now to allow private companies to be part of it. So for me in my company, one of the things that we're struggling with is it's one thing to say this is the last international space station this is the last space station that will be owned and operated by the federal government. It's another thing to truly let us go out there, use the bandwidth, use the resources to have a multiplicity of platforms and not just pick one or two winners.
I think mindset is key when it comes to how you interact with a regular environment, because a lot of times what you might see on a piece of paper is open to interpretation. And so, is there when it comes to any kind of licensing activity, is there presumed intent to say yes, provided enough information is made available, or is it the presumption is not really unless you can get over a really high bar? And we're seeing in the commercial remote sensing space an active dialogue on that very question about what the nature of the mindset should be, and if in fact the mindset is to presume approval initially, can that be backed up by changes in actual regulation, changes in actual process that facilitate that? I mentioned the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act once already. There are elements of that when it comes to the commercial remote sensing environment that try to ingrain in statute and ultimately in regulations the mindset of approval, the mindset of enabling commercial space to evolve faster is beneficial to government security, it's beneficial to our commerce, it's beneficial to our society, et cetera, right? So that combination and relationship between mindset and what changes on paper and the dance between those and how they evolve over time is really key.
What about from your perspective, Jen? And is there you in the SBIR program, you have the ability to really shape where government funds go. If NASA saw this as a problem, how would you see it shaping, or how do you see your community being able to respond?
Yeah, I also think that there's, to build off an important point that Rich made, the law could say one thing, and it could be interpreted in a very different way, and it could be implemented through a suboptimal process. So there's lots of different levels at which you can engage. It might not actually require a regulatory change. The rule could be very clear, but the gains could be had through streamlining processes. And so from where I sit, I am not covered by a regulation other than I execute my program through contracts instead of grants, which means I'm covered by the FAR, or the NASA version of the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. But I have the ability to work on streamlining processes associated with that to the extent of, the power that I have, right? So a small business should engage with me in trying to figure out how to streamline processes to cut down the time for approval, create more certainty on what that approval process looks like, perhaps increase transparency between the groups. So those types of things are things that that can be incredibly impactful at a lower level than like, oh, I need to go to Congress and get a change in like these 3 words. Sometimes the 3 words have to change if there's like a specific prohibition or the law is very clear. But sometimes, there's lots of other tools beyond just what the law says that can help to enable or completely discourage different activities.
In terms of encouraging, saying, Jeffrey, when we started talking about the work you've done with China, or continue to do in China, are there, to the extent we look back on the International Space Station as incredibly resilient in U.S.-Russia relationship, despite activities on the ground, are there commercial-to-commercial analogies to those sort of bonds? Not necessarily with Russia, but is there a model of increased resilience through a growing multinational, international commercial space business, or do national barriers prevent it?
I was there when we opened up to Russia, and there's an example. We did a lot of the wrong things for the right macro reasons. It was 92, 93. We wanted to embrace the new Yeltsin regime. I admit I'm part of the guilty party. I helped bring about the overture to the Russians, helped open the door with the Russians. We felt that we were doing it for the right reason, and we did it, by the way, without telling really the Europeans. We just sort of went ahead and did this, and suddenly the International Space Station was now completely dependent on the Russians. And there were many on the Hill who were completely opposed to this, both working with Russia and opposed to having the Russians so central. But with China, and I just want folks to know I have other customers besides, Russia and China. Okay, this is the exception here. Okay, I just want to know this.
They're popular countries in the resilience discussion.
Right.
Yes.
We have customers in 30 nations, and including Americans. Okay, so but anyway, I've been giving this a lot of thought quickly lately because when we began to reach out to the Russians, capitalism was new to them. Okay, they knew space, but capitalism, free markets, competition, rules of the road were new to the Russians. Today, as I'm trying, and maybe others to reach, and the Europeans reaching out to the Chinese, they're fairly new to space, but not to markets. Okay, there's a fundamental difference there. They have their own billionaires who have made it by legitimate means, and hedge funds and internet and automotive manufacturing and aviation. And so there's, in terms of, if you want to say resiliency, the Chinese are going to make it in space. Okay, they call new space commercial aerospace. And we see in China, the major, they call them state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, are spinning off commercial. I've met with many private investors. One guy said to me, I control 23 different funds. And I said, well, I can't talk to you if there are any, oh no, I said, he said, I said, I can't talk to you if your funds are controlled by the government. He said, oh, no problem. I have 12 controlled by the government and 8, something not controlled by the government. So these people are commercial. They have slightly different than us in marketplaces, but, so be it. They're going to be successful. And I can remember a few years ago, maybe you can help me here, where DOD was saying sometimes we welcome foreign components in the, and I'm not suggesting for China, but in the supply chain, it gives a resiliency. I can envision 5-8 years from now, the Europeans are going to have a pretty high dependency on Chinese manufacturers for space components, the way we do for computers and cell phones. So there's something coming down the road here that we should address. It's coming, and do we want to be part of it, or do we want to boycott it?
So I have an interesting one from the audience. I have to apologize, Rich, but it's directed at you here. It's not personal, but well, you have an incredible tool you're creating, ability to image Earth, the entire Earth every day. I think is your current capability, or the land mass of Earth every day. Is there a potential? How do you think about or deal with the potential for misuse of this information, whether from foreign governments, other actors?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, so it's a question that the company thinks about, the company's leadership and the company's founders think about, all the time. And it is in part the reason why we are a regulated industry, precisely because of that. There is a general philosophy inside the company that was key to its founding, that more information, the same information in particular, shared by more people, creating more insights that can be replicated, that sort of decreases barriers to information and in some respects creates or improves transparency, will generally lead to better decision making and opportunities for people to avoid distrust or mistakes based on asymmetrical information. And it is a true fact that the potential exists that any tool can be turned into a weapon. I'm sure the people at Planet are going to be mad that I phrased it that way, but any bit of information can be used for good or for ill. What we strive to do is be open about our plans. We make the information available open via the internet instead of sort of traditional ways of FTP delivery or hard drive delivery or other things. For the purposes of simplifying access to the information, we want to create a queryable Earth where nearly anybody anywhere can go learn about what's happening to their planet. And we think that the clear balance of that is for the positive, and that it outweighs the chance for the negative. You can't deny that, but we think it's outweighed.
And so it sort of brings us to where we started. But Al, so I'll give it, let's imagine fast forward, right? Mm-hmm. Where, Planet now has the capability, you're an active satellite servicer, mm-hmm. Service available. Mm-hmm. Do you imagine, a set of constraints on who you're going to be able to do business with because of a threat potential? Is that something you're imagining? And if so, should we start talking about that now, right? Is that potentially limiting your business case, either unnecessarily or perhaps wisely?
Mm-hmm. So, very good question. First of all, that answer reminded me of a lot of the discussion going on with regards to social media and how Facebook is looking at itself and saying, okay, are we doing good or not good here? And rethinking about, how information sharing can be used in both ways. And it's intriguing. I haven't thought about Planet in that context, but very intriguing. So, two things. DARPA's RSGS program is intended to set up and then spin off through a public-private partnership a capability for general purpose satellite servicing that is sustained by commercial venture. And that commercial venture can serve the government users and again, it goes back to, commercial for the benefit of government, or it can serve commercial clients, and that's up to, us to sell the service and conduct the servicing and so forth. There's no additional restrictions from other space activities that are going on with regards to who we serve with that satellite servicing. Now, having said that, DARPA spun out also, in parallel with RSGS, a program called CONFERS. And CONFERS is intended, they just selected ATI and Secure World Foundation to manage that, and it's going to be a consortium of interested companies to set kind of guidelines, code of conduct, thinking about how you perform RPO, satellite servicing, how you do the types of activities in a positive way. Also setting kind of a watermark for international actors who are also going to be doing this very soon. It's not only the US doing satellite servicing. I think just yesterday there was an announcement that the UK's Effective Space is going to be doing a life extension. So there's already an international, and of course Orbital ATK is often doing a life extension. So there's a number, and it's going to be international. Setting kind of the expectation for how we behave is going to be extremely important. I think the restrictions, the export control restrictions and the DoD restrictions on who we serve, I think will be applied to satellite servicing in the same way that it's applied in many other regards: launch systems, communications, payloads, imaging, and so forth. So it's a new domain, and it is going to require and benefited from some new policy and regulation. But overall, I think it's going. I'm encouraged that the government is promoting and facilitating a lot of this capability, and RSGS is one example of that.
And so I think we're getting close to the end here, so we'll wrap up with let you each have some final thoughts. And so as this resilience, I imagine the resilience discussion will continue in a lot of different areas, national security side, civil side, government and commercially. As that discussion continues, is there a message that you think that policymakers or other actors just should keep in mind, from your perspective, as they think about this area? Start with you, government.
Thank you. So I think one part of the small businesses' role in this entire ecosystem is that we recognize that they are small, so they can take on, as I said before, less burden, or absorb less burden in processes. And we want to go to them for technologies through our program that can actually help in addressing some of these resiliency and redundancy questions that we've brought up throughout the day today. So even in our current solicitation that's open, we do one solicitation a year, it's open right now. I think I counted this morning 20 out of the 80 plus subtopics that are in there have something to do with components of technology systems, whether it's autonomy, advanced manufacturing, additive manufacturing, small satellite technologies, components that could help enable and create more resiliency through more stable systems like rad-hardened circuits technology and electronics. We can be part of the technology solution, right? Some of the technology and components that could feed into solving some of the problem, not the whole problem. We're not going to solve the world for 125K, of course not. However, SBIR can play a really, really important role in buying down the risk on risk reduction in some of those areas. And we shouldn't be unnecessarily putting more and more barriers and more burdens on these small businesses it's easier to add to legislation than it is to take away, right? So every year that there's a new SBIR reauth, there's new stuff that's added. There's never anything taken away. So now it's really long. A fun fact, when I took this job, before I took the job, I sat down to read the legislation, because before I take any job, I look at my authorizing legislation, because that tells you what you can and can't do, like the law. It took me 4 or 5 hours in a coffee shop on one Saturday just to read the law that covers SBIR. So it's really long. It's really long. So I would just encourage folks to think very carefully and ask the small businesses before they add additional requirements that could sound like a great idea, but add additional requirements, because we could very easily stifle this system that really is the poster child for small business innovation for the rest of the world. Other countries drool at the fact that we have an SBIR program in the US, that we spend this amount of money. NASA spent $3.3 billion through this program over the last 35 years, and we pale in comparison to DoD and NSF, DOE, and we pale in comparison to NIH too. So we are the seed fund for future innovations that can solve some of these problems. Don't throw water on it.
I know we're getting near the end here. Thinking about it, the space program has been run for the last few decades in a highly centralized way. And I suppose another word for resiliency is decentralization. And I suppose what smaller companies and commercial space bring is decentralization. It's no longer one agency, two agencies, one shuttle giving us access to space. We're decentralizing. And decentralization means resiliency. That's good for strategic purposes. It's good for commercial purposes.
So I would amplify, and I hope the message has already been received, but I would amplify that commercial space is very vibrant. It has capital investment, it has innovators, technical innovators, business innovators, and it has products. Commercial ComSat may be one of the most established and known, but we're working with a number of people like Planet who are just as credible in providing not only the spacecraft and the products, but also the services in the end. And I would encourage the government to look at it from that broader context, not just do they have a widget or should we build our own widget. The services are just as feasible. And in wrapping up, I would definitely again reiterate thanks for CSIS and MITRE Corporation. And Peyton will finish your job application right after this, okay?
I'll try to be fast since I'm the last. I just say keep making small bets. So COTS 10, 12 years ago started as some small bets. Commercial Crew is a small bet, or started that way. The work that NanoRacks has got started, satellite servicing at DARPA, NOAA purchases, small purchases of commercial observation data to support weather. NASA in this year looks like they're going to be maybe exploring commercial constellation data purchases to support their science work. Keep making small bets, I would say to the government folks in decision-making and policy-making positions. You probably at the level of investment that's coming, things like small launch, you could probably double down or triple down on the number of small bets that you're doing and seed lots of ideas. And don't be afraid to have a little competition when you're making those small bets and seeding multiple pathways for the same thing that you might want at the end. I think all of it will pay off really, really well.
Well, thank you all. If we could, extend thanks to this great panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
If the panel will just stay for a moment. I'm sorry. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program, and I'll just quickly close the conference as opposed to have them awkwardly walk off the stage while I'm talking. It's really my pleasure to get to do all the thank yous for today. So for Todd and his team, in particular Thomas Roberts from his Aerospace Security Program, who was the main coordinator of the event today. Thank you all for the hard work in pulling this together. The rest of that team, Caitlin Johnson, Seamus Daniels, Kyle Libby, and the conferencing team here at CSIS. And a special thank you to all our moderators today, Sean O'Keefe, Chris Davenport, and Mike French. And our keynote speaker, Robert Lightfoot, who's the acting administrator of NASA. He had very thoughtful comments today. Last but not least, thank you to the team from MITRE, of Laura Naramore, and her whole team for their sponsorship and support of the event. You see behind you or around you the website for our newly launched, sorry for the bad pun, aerospace website, which is aerospace.csis.org. On there, if you haven't already looked it up, you're going to find all of CSIS's analysis and data-driven commentaries related to the technological, budgetary, and policy issues for air and space domains. They're coming from across CSIS expert areas, and also guest contributors. It's also where we are featuring, Aerospace 101, which is a new article series for introducing technical concepts in aerospace engineering, aerospace security, and space policy with short introductions, key facts, and examples, and those are helpful to a policy wonk like me, as opposed to an aerospace engineer like Todd. So for all of you who are aerospace engineers but have people who don't understand you, maybe you can send them there, and we can all then understand you better. So with that, please join me in a round of applause for the panel and for the day's events. Thank you all very much.